My name is Kerry Griffin. I'm the staff officer on the Pacific Fishery Management Council. I'm pinch hitting for this Habitat Committee meeting. Jennifer Gilden is the staff officer who runs the Habitat Committee, but I staff marine planning issues, so that's why I'm pinch hitting for her. And again, the chair of the Habitat Committee is Lance Hebden. And so well, first I'm going to turn to Chuck Tracy, who is our executive director, for a couple of opening remarks. And then we can turn it over to Lance, but we're pending making sure that we have our attendees. So why don't we go to Chuck, and then we'll go to Lance, and at that point we can make sure that we have all of our presenters on board. So there's my overview of ground rules, and I think I'll turn it over to Chuck Tracy, the Pfmc Executive Director.
Hey everybody, I won't take much time here. We're already running a bit late and suffering through some technical difficulties, but I just really wanted to extend my thanks to the folks at BOEM and Office of Aquaculture for reaching out and being so willing to come and brief us up on this important topic. I'm really looking forward to working with them over the course of the near and perhaps more distant future in terms of getting marine planning issues like aquaculture and offshore energy development in front of the council, and keeping our lines of communication open, and they've both been great about that. So we're just glad to be able to take this next step. So thank you again for being so willing to help us out here. Thank you, and I'll see if I can make room for somebody else and catch the recording when it's posted. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Why don't you go ahead, Lance, and I'll keep scrolling to see if our other presenters have been able to join.
Okay, this is Lance Hebden. I'm chairing the Habitat Committee. Welcome to the, we have a packed house today. So with a fairly good amount of information we're going to try to cover in this meeting. Our first general topic, Noaa opportunity, aquaculture opportunity areas. We have about an hour and a half on the agenda for that. That should allow some time for questions and discussions. Since one of the goals of this meeting is to allow the Habitat Committee to prepare a report on these topics for the supplemental briefing book, we're going to give Habitat Committee members kind of first shot at questions or clarifications. Then we'll go to other advisory body members. And if we have time, we'll take questions from members of the public. So from 1:15 to 2:45, we'll do the Noaa aquaculture opportunity areas. About 3 o'clock, we will start the BOEM offshore wind agenda item. And I'd like to note that Ben Ruttenberg will be added to the list of presenters. And then we'll wrap up about 4:30, and the Habitat Committee will continue meeting and working on the supplemental report for the council's briefing book. Again, this is an open meeting. Appreciate everyone showing up. And please mute yourself when you're speaking. I would also like to note that in scrolling through the attendees list, most of the Habitat Committee is present, and also notice that John Hansen with the West Coast Ocean Alliance is here. They're a solid partner in these marine planning efforts, so I'd like to welcome John. And with that, if Diane is ready, you can transfer screen to her.
Hey, Lance, let me pause just for a sec there. I still don't see Ben or Andy, but there are several phone numbers I don't recognize. So if Ben Ruttenberg or Andy Lanier, if you're one of those phone numbers, can you please speak up?
And this is Frank. I just talked to Andy Lanier, and he will not be able to be here till just around 3 or a little after that. He's booked up solid till then.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
And Lance, this is Diane Wyndham. Since we have a combined presentation, I was just going to have James share his screen then we'll have a more seamless presentation, if that's okay. I don't know if you need to hand that off to him.
That's great. I think you actually mentioned that yesterday and I didn't note it, so.
That's no biggie. We're used to flying by the seat of our pants. So.
Okay, I stopped sharing, so you guys should be able to, there you go, I see it.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'll try and catch us up on time as much as possible. So many of you I know. Those of you that I don't, it's nice to meet you virtually. I'm Diane Wyndham. I'm the Noaa Fisheries West Coast Region Aquaculture Coordinator for California. And with me today is James Morris and Jonathan Mackay from the National Ocean Service's National Coastal Centers for Ocean Science. And together we're going to give you an overview of the spatial planning work that we've been doing for the aquaculture opportunity areas. And I'd like to thank Carrie and Lance and of course Chuck for pulling together this webinar and working with us to execute this today. So thank you so much. James, next slide, please. So just to refresh your memories, and apologies if this is somewhat redundant for you, there was an executive order on promoting American seafood competitiveness and economic growth issued on May 7th of 2020. And Section 7 of that executive order called for the identification of aquaculture opportunity areas, and those areas were to be identified over the span of about 7 years in total for 10 aquaculture opportunity areas. This is a planning exercise. I've tried to emphasize this, but it is a planning exercise and not a regulatory action. AOAs can be in state or federal waters, and it does not affect the existing permitting process. So as it is a planning process, even with a designated aquaculture opportunity area, any applicant that wanted to pursue developing a farm in an AOA would still need to go through the standard permitting process. And relative to state agencies, or excuse me, state waters, we are not inserting ourselves into the state waters piece unless invited by the state. So our focus is primarily in federal waters and can include state waters if asked by those specific states. In addition to the executive order, shortly after its issuance, Noaa announced the first 2 geographic areas that would undertake the aquaculture opportunity area development. Federal waters off of Southern California and the Gulf of Mexico were selected for science-based evaluation for these first 2 AOAs. These areas were selected based on already available spatial data analysis, as well as industry interest in developing sustainable marine aquaculture in these areas. We published a request for information in the Federal Register in October, asking for public comment, as well as recommendations for data sources and for geographic areas for future AOAs to complete that total of 10. The public comment period closed on December 22nd. We also hosted several public listening sessions during that comment period. Next slide, please. So the year 1 steps for this process consisted of, in August, we identified the first 2 areas and began the data collection for siting analysis, as well as ongoing outreach to help educate and communicate about the AOA concept. The public notice, the request for information, did specifically request input on siting in these 2 initial areas, as well as thinking about where to focus the next 8. All of this information will then go into draft aquaculture opportunity atlases for Southern California and for the Gulf of Mexico. And these atlases will combine public input, we will combine public input and the results of the atlas to identify the potential AOAs that would then be analyzed in a programmatic EIS for each geographic area. Next slide, please. We have been and continue to conduct extensive stakeholder engagement. This just gives you a feel for the number of meetings that we have had for the Southern California AOA effort, as well as nationally, and the types of stakeholders that we have been meeting with and the attendance that we have seen. In addition, we've had, as I mentioned, several public listening sessions and specific listening sessions for Southern California and the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide, please. And just to give the Habitat Committee a sense of what we're talking about, so we're considering aquaculture, offshore aquaculture in the broader context of sort of a combination of types of aquaculture. So that includes finfish aquaculture, illustrated here so that you can get a sense for the differences in gear types. Next slide, please. Also includes offshore mussel on longline aquaculture, illustrated in this slide. Next slide, please. And macroalgae farms, illustrated in this slide. So that gives you a sense of the types of aquaculture that could be considered for these AOAs. So now I'm going to hand it over to James Morris from the National Ocean Service in COS, and he will be presenting the remainder of our program.
Okay, thank you, Diane. Just give me a sound check. Everything sound good?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes, you sound good.
Okay, great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to visit with you about some of this work that is happening around aquaculture and at national and regional levels. I want to just share with you, though, that aquaculture work is happening in 3 line offices within our agency. It's happening within the Line Office of Ocean and Atmospheric Research, or OAR, which houses our sea grant programs. We also have aquaculture work happening in the National Marine Fisheries Service, of which Diane is one of our regional aquaculture coordinators. Aquaculture work happens within the NIMP science centers and the regional offices, and really across the nation works to develop policy and infrastructure support and research and development, those kind of things. And then I work in the National Ocean Service, and we focus a lot on spatial planning and monitoring and modeling and environmental impacts and ecosystem services and those kind of things. And together, these 3 line offices constitute the Noaa Aquaculture Program. I'd like to talk with you specifically about marine spatial science for pioneering aquaculture, and certainly the principles are not new to the science of marine spatial planning. But we are really breaking, I think, some new ground when it comes to marine spatial science for aquaculture. We use geospatial data for industry and coastal managers. We work to develop publicly available map viewers. We develop spatial planning infrastructure and do alternative siting analysis specifically for projects around the nation. And then we also provide regional and national planning, both like in terms of these opportunity areas, but also supporting economic development opportunity analysis in states as well as federal waters as well. We are focused primarily on serving a customer base, which are federal and state agencies. Really, it's amazing when you think about all the different coastal management agencies that are at the table when it comes to aquaculture. We work to sit really knee to knee and eye to eye with those coastal managers to try to understand what their questions are about aquaculture management regulation. And we work to bring some science tools and science assessments and support for the Coastal Management Working Group as they're working to evaluate state and federal waters management when it comes to aquaculture development. So we've worked to develop a blended research and services portfolio, and we really appreciate that blended portfolio because our services works to inform the kind of science questions that we ask, and then our science certainly informs the services that we provide. So there's 4 types of support that we're providing on a routine basis to coastal management around the nation. This includes spatial planning, environmental modeling, environmental science guidance, and then engineering review. Yeah, I'm having some if folks can mute their microphone, I think that would be helpful. Lance, can you tell whose mic is hot and turn that off for me? So I want to share with you some of the work that we're doing on planning and siting. So we are working at the aquaculture opportunity areas level nationally. We're working to also provide support to states as they work to designate aquaculture use areas. We have provided support for planning for ports and harbors around the nation. And over the last 5 years, we've conducted about 50 spatial analysis, specifically looking at aquaculture opportunities and aquaculture development approaches around the nation. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, you'll see that there are clusters of activity happening in coastal ocean waters, in the Northeast, the Gulf of Mexico, and Southern California. We are seeing also interest in aquaculture development in the Pacific Islands, in Alaska, in numerous areas of coastal ocean around the nation. But we certainly have clustering happening within those 3 regions I mentioned earlier. These are some examples of siting projects underway. There are approximately 10 to 15 projects now which are they're working through the permitting process in federal waters around the U.S. We're working on all of these and are working to really ensure that these first projects are permitted at the highest standard to be able to avoid the challenges and make sure that that lessons that have been learned internationally and even domestically are being applied in the permitting process. One of the areas that we focus on to do this includes understanding impacts of aquaculture and interactions of aquaculture on water quality. It's fairly well known around the world that most types of aquaculture can be sited sustainably. It just requires that we pay attention to where and how we are developing aquaculture. And we have worked to bring in and import some modeling approaches from around the world to be able to do things like forecast effluents from aquaculture, look at the aquaculture cycles, and help our Environmental Protection Agency and others in the Coastal Management Working Group to answer those questions around water quality interactions, both in terms of positive and negative interactions. To do this, we've also been working on a monitoring guidance series and everything from baseline environmental surveys to protected species interactions and benthic and water quality monitoring for offshore shellfish and finfish. We really like tools, and we work a lot on trying to extend the science into tool approaches, and GIS really lends itself well to tool development. So we have been working over the past several years to develop specific tools that can be impactful to understanding and impactful for facilitating pioneering coastal ocean industry development. For example, we have been mining data. We have built big data resources. Our Aquadata catalog is one of the largest catalogs of marine spatial data in the U.S., and this catalog is really valuable for doing marine spatial planning when it comes to for many types of coastal ocean development, but specifically for aquaculture. We have built a tool called Ocean Reports, so I'll talk to you about that in a second. We have done National Aqua Mapper. We've worked on wave exposure modeling to be able to look at energy and aquaculture interactions, and a few other tools. We really believe in the power of big data to support spatial planning. We've worked to pull together data from state and federal agencies, non-environmental NGOs, and others that are collecting data. And really, we're working now in really a framework of big data, similar to what would exist on land. If you were looking to site sustainably, for example, a store for a major corporation, those folks use big data to site those facilities. And that's the kind of situation we're in now when it comes to ocean and ocean commerce and the ocean economy. It's a big data world out there, and it takes a geographic information system to really navigate through that big data to be able to answer the where and the how questions. One of those tools is Ocean Reports, and we're excited over the last year to have released this application. This builds on about 10 years of data collection and about $10 million of investment into marine spatial data. We were able to utilize the Marine Cadastre Marine Data Repository, which was built in partnership with our colleagues at Pfmc, to build this first automated web application. With this application, anyone sitting in their recliner from home on their desktop computer can draw a box anywhere in the coastal ocean, and within 1 second receive a customized spatial analysis for that ocean neighborhood of which they just drew a box. It returns about 81 infographics covering the oceanography, the natural resources, the shipping and transportation and other industries that are working within that ocean neighborhood. It analyzes about 160 vector and raster data. Over 100 queries are performed, and it really is one of the most powerful marine spatial analytical tools on the planet, largely because of the automated nature of it. An analysis really can be done in a second, and it can be repeated an infinite number of times for as many ocean neighborhoods as one wants to analyze within the entire U.S. ocean. So I would encourage you to check it out. Not now, because you'll get lost and you won't pay attention to the rest of the slides, but at some point, we encourage you to check out the Ocean Reports application. Here, for example, as what you will find as you draw a box somewhere in the coastal ocean. For the oceanography report, you'll see wave height, period direction, current speed, current direction, water temperature, salinity, and the wet chemistry of that ocean space. Similar when it comes to natural resources and conservation, there's data that are displayed in terms of endangered species, critical habitat designations, the HAPCs, migratory species, bird areas, protected areas, artificial reefs. And it's really an amazing tool, which is advancing understanding and intelligence during pre-application and early Nepa scoping and even project planning by industry, as industry is beginning to discover this tool and use it to be able to learn more about the ocean neighborhoods of which they have an interest. Lastly, I'd like to share with you that we are really working in this modeling space and simulation space to be able to understand protected species interactions, and we understand that because of the immature nature of offshore aquaculture in the U.S., that we have many questions and many challenges ahead in terms of ensuring that the design of these facilities are done sustainably and that they don't can add additional threat to some of our most protected species. And so here we are also partnering with our colleagues at Pfmc to develop an entanglement simulator, which leverages on virtual reality software simulations, but instead, this is a physics-based simulation tool. So we are building from scratch the virtual models of aquaculture systems and, in fact, floating wind farm systems, and are building a simulator that has the capacity to look at the interactions between both the virtual animal model and the virtual gear models. The power of a simulator like this will be able to analyze tens of thousands of scenarios and then be able to work with engineering to redesign these mooring systems and line systems to be able to reduce entanglement risk, but because we have essentially unpacked the physics of the interactions between the two. So we're pretty excited about that, and we look forward to perhaps talking with you more about that in the future. Jumping to the aquaculture opportunity areas spatial planning work, I'd like to share with you, this is the spatial planning workflow that we are undergoing right now. The first step in the process is to identify our planning goal. And here we have sat down with industry and we have learned from industry about the kinds of ocean space that they are interested in farming that meet their gear requirements and species requirements and such for the Southern California area. That then allows us to develop study areas based on the criteria of the project needs. Then we then go about a data inventory and screening process. We then are able to build a suitability model that looks at where aquaculture might be possible within those study areas. We then can select the highest scoring areas within the study area using a cluster analysis, and eventually we'll be able to publish an atlas that describes those ocean areas and the options within those ocean areas for the aquaculture opportunity areas. So I'm going to like to walk you through quickly the spatial modeling process, and then want to show you some preliminary results and examples of data and how we use the data in the modeling process. So we are building a suitability model. We're looking for, within study areas, we're looking for the best locations for aquaculture development. And as Diane mentioned, those best locations will be evaluated as during an environmental impact statement. And ultimately, one of those areas will eventually become the aquaculture opportunity area. But my job is to lead a team of scientists and spatial scientists to look at the options, to develop a series of options of about a half of a dozen or so options from point conception to San Diego, basically, that will be evaluated as part of the EIS. In order to identify those options, we're using a suitability modeling process. So the first step that we do is we collect data. So the data table on the left-hand side is an example of data. I can tell you that we have a lot more data than you'll see here, where we have hundreds of data layers that go into this modeling process. But this is for an example. We identify areas with the highest opportunity for aquaculture and areas that provide the highest conservation and lowest conflict with users using these data. So we will identify the data that's relevant to aquaculture, and we will give it a score. Now, we have teams of scientists that study these data, that study aquaculture, and are able to make determinations about whether an aquaculture is compatible or not with a particular data type. So, for example, the first data layer is hard bottom habitat. We know that in many regions, aquaculture is incompatible with hard bottom habitat for a lot of different reasons. And so that particular data layer, for an example, we get a score of 0. Other data layers in which may have some compatibility, or that compatibility is uncertain, would get a score of a 0.5. And that's for data that are categorical. Either it's present or it's absent. For some data, we have continuous data. These are data that have a range of intensity within the data. For example, vessel traffic data is continuous data. Some of those areas in the ocean have higher intensity of traffic than other types of other areas. For those particular data types, we're able to fit a polynomial function to that data, where the cells in space that have the highest level of traffic, for example, or the highest amount of intensity of data, those cells would get a score that's closer to 0, but not a 0, but closer to 0. Whereas cells within that data set that have the lowest amount of intensity would get scores closer to 1. So we're able to, with continuous data, fit the data to a score between 0 and 1, giving us low compatibility to high compatibility based on the intensity of the data. And this is the case for most of our data like commercial fishing activity, vessel traffic, and those kind of things. So it's important to note that we have both categorical data, we have continuous data. We're able to score appropriately depending on the intensity of the data. And then for categorical data, we typically are going with just 2 scoring options, a 0, which means it's not compatible with aquaculture, and a 0.5, which means that it might be compatible with aquaculture. All right, so the map on the right-hand side, moving on along here, is an example of a study area. For this study area, we will see here on the right-hand corner, you'll see a grid cell. We overlay a grid cell over top of that study area. We're then able to calculate, in this case is a 1 acre grid cell. We're able to calculate the cumulative score, or the average score, I should say, of the grid cell for all the data layers that are in the model. And that gives us the ability to compare scores among all the entire study area. And that allows you to be able to develop a heat map, which shows where the highest scoring cells exist within that study area. Here you can see the dark red areas are areas that have no compatibility with aquaculture because of known conflicts with shipping lanes or with existing oil and gas infrastructure or submarine cables and those kind of things. Whereas the areas that have shaded in green have higher compatibility scores than the areas that are in yellow or orange. And that's as a result of the calculation of the average score within each one of those grid cells. So now that you understand a bit about the structure of the model, I want to move on to the process here for Southern California. Here you have the results of our study areas analysis. We met with industry. Industry said that for both shellfish, finfish, and algae, that generally aquaculture would have to occur between the depths of 10 and 150 meters in order for it to be relevant, for the aquaculture opportunity areas to be relevant to their to industry's needs. And that a distance farther than 25 nautical miles from shore would be very problematic early in industry development. So what we have here is this is a federal waters analysis only. The depth, you see a depth range between 10 and 150 meters and a distance from shore of 25 nautical mile maximum. And we map where those conditions exist. And here you see that we have essentially 4 study areas: Santa Barbara, Santa Monica, Long Beach, and San Diego. So those will become our study areas. Now, in terms of building a model, these are the results so far of our data mining efforts. So we have acquired about 88 data layers. We are able to categorize those data layers into 4 submodels: a national security submodel, a natural resources submodel, an industry, navigation, and transportation submodel, and a fishing and aquaculture submodel. And there you can see the distribution of data layers among each one of the submodels. Now, in some cases, we've identified data that lacks the spatial resolution or spatial diversity, and let's say this data layer is homogeneous. Let's say that it's, for example, a data layer of a particular habitat for a highly migratory species that encompasses the whole Southern California bight. That data layer doesn't bring any heterogeneity to it. It doesn't help us in suitability modeling because it's the same everywhere. It's larger than our study areas. With those kind of data layers, we place them in a category called characterization. It's still important to know that exists within, that feature exists within the ocean neighborhood, but it has no value to us in terms of spatial modeling. And we have identified about 116 data layers that are useful for characterization. So after we have run the suitability models, we're also going to use those data layers to characterize those ocean neighborhoods of which we have modeling results. So jumping directly to the modeling results. Now I'm going to jump through these slides really fast. I'm going to keep you oriented along the way. But generally what you want to be looking at are general trends. We're going to have, the slides are going to remain pretty consistent in terms of the Santa Barbara study area being on the top left, Santa Monica being on the top right, Long Beach being in the bottom left, and San Diego being on the bottom right. And these are the results of the overall suitability modeling for the national security submodel. So here what you see is that we have significant interactions happening for Camp Pendleton and San Diego. Those areas are red. We have incompatibility for aquaculture development really within that study area. Now I should tell you that with any time you get a 0 for an incompatibility, that zeroes out that grid cell for the rest of the submodels as well. So in this case, we really aren't going to be talking really anymore about San Diego throughout the presentation because it gets knocked out because of military interactions. But if you look at Santa Barbara and Santa Monica and Long Beach, you'll see that there is some compatibility with national security, and there's also some interactions, but at the higher suitability level than we have for San Diego. Drifting through here, you see the Santa Barbara military data. We're able to characterize the amount of the percentage of the study area that's affected by the individual data layers that you see here on the bottom left, the amount of acreage there, and the scores that are applied to those data layers. I'm not going to try to go through all the data layers, just wanted to show you the process that we're going through to understand how these data layers affect the suitability scores. So this shows you the Santa Monica study area and the Long Beach study area, and you can see the data there that affect those. Jumping to the living resources submodel, the natural resources submodel, I'd like for you to look for just a moment here at the patterns of suitability and unsuitability or lack of suitability that's across these study areas, with the blue being the areas that have the highest suitability and red meaning lowest suitability. Again, to remind you, this is a relative suitability score for each one of these study areas, and each study area is a unique model. So it's really can't compare colors or scores among the different study areas because each model is unique to the individual study area. But here you see patterns of areas that get kicked out for various reasons. For Santa Barbara, we have interactions happening with gray whale and humpback whale. We have the national marine sanctuaries there at Channel Islands that gets a score of 0, so that gets kicked out. You see those red areas are the areas that get kicked out. You have hard bottom habitat, deep sea corals, and those kind of things there affecting the patterns of suitability within that study area. Looking at Santa Monica, similar data and similar patterns in terms of just of suitability and unsuitable areas. And for Long Beach, and what we're really looking at from this analysis is where's blue? You know, where's the highest suitable cells that we can begin to analyze further. Looking at our industry submodel, and this submodel is one that has the highest impact in terms of compatibility with aquaculture. Here you see great large areas of the Long Beach and Santa Monica. It's probably not surprising to many of you that know this region, the amount of industry interactions that are happening there. Looking at the Santa Barbara study area, you'll see here we have vessel traffic interactions, we have lease blocks, and those kind of things that really drive and affect the study area in terms of compatibility. There's additional data here. That was a large amount of data there for the Santa Barbara study area. For Santa Monica, we have similar trends happening there. You can see the reds and the blues. And then for Long Beach as well. So now we're beginning to see patterns emerging, you know, in terms of specific areas within the study areas that are staying blue along the way. Moving quickly to our fishing and aquaculture submodel, which I believe is the last submodel before I show you the completed composite or overall suitability scores that takes into account all of the submodels. Here you see the overview of just the fishing and aquaculture interactions data. Looking at Santa Barbara here, we have various types of fishing data. We have, and you can see there how those fishing data interact with suitability scores. For example, state-managed trawl VMS data interacts with 125,000 acres within that study area. The CRFS fishing data, observer trawl data. But you can generally see the patterns of fishing that are happening within that study area. For Santa Monica, there you can see general patterns. And for Long Beach, and the red is an existing aquaculture facility. And then San Diego. So lastly, getting to the end of this talk, this is the overall composite. I want to remind everyone, these are preliminary findings. We're still doing the modeling, but we wanted to talk with you about the modeling process and the spatial planning process here. But we're beginning to see some trends in terms of where there may be opportunities to pursue options for evaluation for the EIS. We see some blue area here off of Santa Barbara. We see some blue area here off of Santa Monica. We have a bit of blue area off of Huntington Beach, and none off of San Diego. So what we will do next is we will look specifically within those blue areas and attempt to better understand what is driving the suitability scores within those areas. And this is an example of the types of figures that we will be publishing in the atlas, that are descriptive maps that show what the drivers that are affecting the scores across the entire ocean neighborhood there. Our last step in the process is to do a cluster analysis where we're able to pull out the highest suitability scores within those study areas. So here, this cluster analysis that you see for Santa Barbara pulls out the highest blue scores, and you see that we're looking at about 38,000 acres from the Santa Barbara study area. Our next step in that would be to subdivide those areas into small areas that are between 500 and 2,000 acres in size. And then to use a precision siting model to identify which 2 or 3 within this entire study area, and we're looking at the ones that are in green, we'll use a precision siting model to identify the best locations possibly for consideration for AOAs. Now, this is an example of a DoD, Department of Defense, mission compatibility analysis. The areas that in blue are the highest ranking grid cells, and then we have superimposed on top of that squares that between 500 and 2,000 acres. And we submitted all those squares for DoD clearance. And they have evaluated those, and the ones that are in green are cleared, and the ones that are in yellow and red are incompatible or have stipulations. So we're using our precision siting model to now go in and select one of these cells here and to put, or a few of these to put forward into the EIS process. In conclusion, I'll show you the Santa Monica study area, for example. We'll be doing the same in terms of gridding these and putting that through the DoD review and into the EIS process, as well as the area off of Huntington Beach there, a Long Beach area, about 6,000 acres. We'll only be looking for anywhere between 500 and 2,000 acre options within those 2 study areas. And again, none for San Diego. So I know that was a lot of maps. I know that's a lot of information to go through at one time. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about this, and be happy to stick around with any questions.
Thanks, James. So in order to attempt to manage the questions in this virtual format, if folks have a question for James or Diane, put your name in the chat or raise your hand on the participants list, and we'll try to work through. Habitat Committee first, if you have any questions.
I see. Oh, Arlene's hand was up. It's down now.
Yes, Arlene, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Do you prefer written questions or oral?
No, just go ahead.
Okay. So I was wondering, back to the data development and scoring steps. Just a couple of questions. Do you develop your data categories and then vet those through a process within the local or regional area, just to get feedback on how those data are being developed and classified? And then related to that, for the MPA data, are those all scored equally, or are they scored based on different levels of resource protection?
So for the data vetting, so that was the 150 stakeholder meetings that we held, were really data vetting meetings where we met with stakeholders and data holders, and we discussed this process with them, the executive order and the mission here of the project, and we showed them the data that we had in hand, and we asked questions about if they were aware of any additional data, or if there were any considerations or concerns with how we were using the data and those kind of things. And we received a lot of input, a whole lot of new data opportunities and those kind of things. We've even had to, in some cases, help folks process data to prepare it for this spatial planning process. So we're excited about the fact that there's new data products that are included here to help with this process. So I think that was the challenge here is powering through literally all those meetings to discuss all different types of data, from shipping data to habitat data to protected species data to military data. All those data categories you saw there. We had to go through a vetting. We've gone through a vetting process for those.
Thanks, James. I believe Steve Scheiblower, you should be unmuted.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my question is similar to Arlene's about the quality of the California data, considering that the state uses 10 by 10 mile blocks. Is that granular enough to get what you need, or did you have some other data set that you were using? And then a related question is, as an end result, do you go back to the stakeholders and then kind of give them a, if you will, a sniff test about your results, that it still rings true with them? Thank you.
Sure. So the second question is easy, and we have done sort of return and report meetings with various stakeholders where we showed them the results and the interpretation of the data, and those have been beneficial. There's been a lot of those meetings have happened. If you have a specific data type or group that you're concerned about or something like that, we would love to field that and go into our minutes of meetings and such and double check on those things. In terms of where data have low resolution, there are always challenges with those data. And in some cases, we have always sought the highest resolution possible, whether it be for vessel traffic or fishing or whatever it might be, and worked with the highest resolution possible in the modeling process. But in some cases, the resolution is so large because our study area, and maybe larger, in fact, than some of our study areas, where those data are not impactful in the suitability modeling process, but we still capture that data and use it in the characterization process of that study area and or eventual AOA location. And we will be handing that information off to the folks that are doing the environmental impact statement for further evaluation and comparison as part of the NEPA alternatives.
Any more questions from the Habitat Committee before I move on to other folks?
Hi, Lance. This is Eric Chavez. I have one.
Go ahead, Eric.
Hi, James. Thanks again. I know that's a lot of information to condense and present, so I appreciate it. Looking at your scoring, I'm just curious, when you set up buffers for things like shipwrecks and submarine cables, it seems to be a default of 500 meters. Is there any basis for that? How is that chosen? And I'm a little surprised it doesn't vary depending upon what you're buffering around.
Oh, yeah, it does vary. In fact, we go into the rules and regs and we look to see if there's any legal requirement for buffers. And then we talk with the regulatory community we would talk to the regulatory community about if there's a precedent for buffers for types of coastal development that might affect that, because a lot of times there's existing precedent for buffers. And then if there's not a precedent, we will discuss what would be a good buffer for that. I should tell you, Eric, and I should have mentioned this early in the presentation, that this modeling approach from the start has worked to be conservative, both in terms of environmental scores that for environmental data and scores for conflicting data, spatial conflicting data. And we have erred on the side of being really conservative, ultra conservative, because this process is only looking for really a couple of thousand acres, and really only about a half a dozen locations of which to choose from for that 2,000 acres for the whole entire region. So we have the luxury, we have the ability to be very conservative, through this modeling process. So in some cases with buffers and such, you'll see as you walk through our methodologies that we have always sort of chosen a big buffers and erred on the side of precautionary principles when it comes to interactions with sensitive habitats or those kind of things.
Thank you.
Hey, Lance, this is Kerry. Do I qualify as a Habitat Committee member?
For today, yes.
I'll probably get fired. I know I'll get fired, but after today's glitch. But James, when you were showing the suitability models looking at fisheries and aquaculture, I think that it was characterized as, I forget the terminology, dynamic or real-time or something like that, as opposed to more static. I know I'm not using the right terminology, but I hope you know what I'm referring to. And so I'm, can you talk a little bit more about that, the difference between sort of, static fishing areas? Obviously an aquaculture facility is static, but opportunity areas are often static also. I guess they're both.
Yeah, I understand. I think what you're referring to is the two types of data that we have. One would be categorical data, which is like a 1 or a 0, is absent, is present or absent, like artificial reefs or oil and gas platform or an artificial reef. And then we have numerical data or continuous data. Most should have used numerical as the term earlier. And that data is data that has intensity from high to low and those kind of things. And a lot of fishing data, for example, we have effort, you have intensity, and those kind of things. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think that is what I was referring to. So I think I was misunderstanding the the character or the nature of the data. So that helps.
Okay. Yeah, and the thing to remember about that data is that we fit a curve to that. So the highest intensity areas, would receive the lowest compatibility score, and then the lowest intensity parts of that data or spaces that that data covers would receive the highest compatibility score.
Got it. Thank you.
Since we have plenty of time left for questions, I'm going to go out to other advisory body members. Richard, all I see is a Richard's iPad. So if you're Richard and that's your iPad, shoot your question.
Thank you very much. I can turn my video on here and we'll see if this actually works. My question kind of revolves around, the model creating aspect of this. At what point I'm a commercial fisherman here on the West Coast in California and actually in Bodega Bay. At what point does the modeling allow for the fishermen to actually interact, and how is that information gathered and then inputted into that model to help understand the effect of the actions that are occurring in that area? I'm just curious about at what point do the fishermen get involved and actually have input? Thank you.
want to kick that one to Diane, talk a little bit more about the public input process.
Yeah, and James, I don't know if you could throw up that slide, the stakeholder involvement slide, but thank you for the question, Dick. Part of the outreach and communicating and public input seeking efforts we have made have included extensive meetings with commercial and recreational fishing associations. Several, I think, are in this room as we are meeting that we have talked with before. So in addition to the actual data, we received that input. We shared the data, not only with the council, but with representatives from PCFFA, and local commercial and recreational fishing organizations, which is reflected in some of these groupings for the stakeholder engagement. I don't know, Dick, if you can see the slide or not, but we've had over 150 different meetings, and almost 500 individuals have participated in these various meetings that did include the commercial and recreational fishing sector, focusing on Southern California because that's where the AOA would be situated, but not limiting the geographic scope of commercial fishing interests. I know that fishermen may come to Southern California from other parts of the state or out of state. So, but the focus from the geographic area is for Southern California. Does that help get at your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. I was having a little trouble unmuting myself, so I apologize. Thank you.
No problem. And also, I just want to emphasize that we'll be engaging in the NEPA process and starting to develop the programmatic environmental impact statement. And for those that aren't aware, the NEPA process is very much a public engagement process. So there will be many future opportunities for your input and for sharing additional information, including but not limited to review of the draft EIS when it's complete.
Hey, Diane, this is Lance. Do you have a formal timeline for initiating the NEPA process?
Great question. So according to the executive order, we are supposed to begin the NEPA scoping in a year from issuance of the executive order. So that would be in May of 2021. We are really being careful to do our due diligence with the data analysis and spatial analysis work to get that as robust and sound as possible. That process has taken a bit longer than originally anticipated. Our sense of this is that, that's time well spent. We would rather be running late in the NEPA process and do a better job and bring better material to the EIS. It is not a regulatory action executive order. It's a planning effort. And so we're anticipating that there's a little bit of slippage in dates anticipated. However, we're not talking about months and months. We're probably talking about weeks. So I think it's fair to say that the NEPA process will officially get underway in late spring, early summer. And we are preparing for that now while the Atlas work is continuing to be refined and finalized. And so, we're getting personnel in place and identifying our strategies for doing the work and forming our internal teams to start the development of the NEPA document. And again, that has a very strong public engagement requirement to it.
All right, thanks, Diane. We'll definitely be looking for that. I believe, Yvonne, you're up next.
Lance. Thanks, James and Diane. I wanted to ask, James, I think it would be helpful for this group in particular if you would talk a little bit more about the fisheries data. So what kind of data did you use? What fisheries were you considering? I saw some of the acronyms you were using, but I suspect other folks would maybe like some discussion of that. Thanks.
Sure. So we can pull up the current fishing data, and let me check the mic. Jonathan, are you on? We've brought one of our spatial scientists as well.
Yeah, I'm here.
Jonathan's here, and we can talk through this together. We also have Taylor from the NEP Science Center, the regional office, that has helped us pull together fishing data as well. So I'm going to pull up for Santa Barbara, for example. Jonathan, you want to talk us through these data sets and kind of dig a little bit more into the fishing data?
Yeah, so we put in fishing data requests with CDFW, and we received additional on squid fisheries. We got VMS, and we also got the raw block data at the 10 nautical mile resolution. And as we discussed earlier, that data is going to be used for characterization. We also have recreational fishing data, so the CPFE, and the SURFs data sets. And then going through the rest of the data, we have from the Northwest Fishery Science Center the observer data. So we have 2 large data sets that encompass multiple fisheries. But that's the higher resolution data that we have. And then we also have lobster catch data, which is logbook data, so it's fine resolution. And then we also have dive logs from a lot of the urchin and sea cucumber fishery. Does that help answer your question?
Yep. Thanks.
Okay, great. And sorry, you had mentioned about acronyms. So the SURFs data is the California Recreational Fishing Surveys. And then the CPFE are the commercial passenger fishing vessels that would take recreational fishers.
Karen, I believe you're next.
Hi, everyone. This is Karen Braby. I am with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Council member, and appreciate the presentation today and hearing more about your planning process. I would love to hear a little bit more about any potential for weighting data layers in your process, and I'm not sure I fully understood exactly how the suitability analysis compares between layers in terms of any weighting. Maybe my understanding is that it's not weighted, but I did hear you talk about certain uses such as military interference would just be kind of a do not go type of result and outcome. But what about others? And to Yvonne's question, how do these aquaculture suitability layers compare to any weighting for current uses by fishing, or is it just all things equal? So thanks for some discussion on that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did not attempt to weight data within the submodels. So just to review the model structure, there are 4 submodels. And then you would get it. We are able to calculate a score, an average score per submodel per cell. And then those 4 submodels score are averaged together for a final score for each cell. And that was a model structure decision, not to try to weight specific a specific type of fisheries data or habitat or VMS type of data, in terms of shipping traffic or any of those kind of things, to try to go in there and give different weights to those things. The rationale for that was really it wasn't necessary because of the amount of the planning level that we were at here. Certainly, it's possible it's going to be part of the EIS process is to take into account different interactions with these potential aquaculture opportunity areas. But at this point, in terms of this broad screening analysis, which is what this is a broad screening analysis, and we're going to hand over the best results from that screening analysis to the EIS process. We felt that this was consistent with the requirements going into the EIS process.
So that's great. And if I can ask a follow-up question, then additional input, for example, from the fishing community, just as an example, could feed into the public process with the EIS on any weighting that should be applied.
Right. Yeah, and it should, that as we go into the EIS process and as there's additional opportunities for public input, if there's new information that would influence the understanding of those neighborhoods, those ocean neighborhoods, that will be taken into consideration as part of the EIS process.
Thanks.
Steve, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I think this is aimed at Diane. I'm sure you're aware that some NGOs have expressed a lot of concern about sort of the industrial nature of finfish farms, and that would be, over antibiotics potentially, or kind of feed that's used, or the waste products that come from them, which of course could be a habitat issue. I'm wondering, has that already been addressed? Is there information available on those potential problems, or is that going to be just an outcome of the Nepa process? Thank you.
I would say that it's a combination of both those things. Obviously, those kinds of concerns and issues should be addressed in the context of the potential AOA within the Nepa process and in the Nepa document. In addition, there is a lot of background and other specific and helpful information that the Noaa organization has produced along these lines, both within the NCOS shop where James and Jonathan work. They have a lengthy number of documents and tech memos and such that inform this kind of information, as well as information on our National Office of Aquaculture webpage. So probably too much to list here and now, but believe me, we are very much aware and trying to be responsive to getting that kind of technical information out there to ensure that there's an accurate understanding of what the offshore aquaculture industry, especially relative to the United States, looks like, and what that kind of a footprint looks like in the scope of offshore ocean activities. We understand there's a lot of misinformation that needs to be corrected, and we are at the NOAA organization are always striving to bring the best available science to those discussions. So to that degree, we do have a lot of existing resources, as well as those issues will be addressed in the PEIS.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Mike Conroy.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. A two-part question, and I think Diane just answered the second part, which is going to be if they were going to lean toward a programmatic EIS for this type of activity. It sounds like she alluded to that. The second part was, and James, I appreciate the update. You and I had a conversation, oh God, it seems like 3 years ago. It was probably just a couple of months ago about this. And as you well know, I was somewhat highly critical of the over-reliance on AIS data and then some of the VMS data that seemed to show fishing activity taking places in areas where that just didn't ring true. Since our conversation, have there been efforts to, and I don't want to use the word correct, but update the actual data on where fishing effort occurs, activity and the like, or is there still a really heavy reliance on VMS and AIS data?
Jonathan, you take that. Can you take that one and talk a bit about the data in addition to the VMS data, and if we have any outstanding data sets coming in?
Sure. So the VMS data that we have is for the trawl fishery, and I don't see any issues that we've had with that data. But we did also acquire observer data, so that would be GPS lat long data from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and then additional CDFW log data as well. So that would be lobster and dive log, which is also GPS lat long.
And Mike, this is Diane. Just to clarify, yes, we are doing a programmatic environmental impact statement for the overall AOA. Any individual project that would want to site a farm within that AOA would have, they would have to engage in the standard permitting process, and that could include additional NEPA specific to that individual project. So just to be clear, this programmatic level is for the entire geographic area of the AOA. Individual projects would tier off of that and would have additional project-specific analyses to conduct.
Thanks, Diane. I believe, Bob Dooley, you are next. We can get you off mute.
Okay, yep, I'm here.
All right.
You hear me now?
Yes. Perfect.
Thanks, Lance. James, it's really, really good to see you here. I know we've council meeting for a while, when I visited you a couple of years ago in Beaufort. And Diane, thanks for all your input as well. It's good to get to know both of you. You talked earlier about granularity of your data, and that some of the data you get from the state sources or federal sources are in blocks that are larger than and not as granular as you're using on your polygons that are the sections you're using. And my question is there a way to augment that data through fishermen's data and verifiable? Can the fishing industry actually help make that data more granular? And is it an ongoing process? Can we be part of that as it goes forward and actually have input into to better define fishing areas?
Hey, Bob. That's a good question. That's a kind of a participatory mapping process. And this executive order only gave us a short window to complete the first two AOAs, and so I'm not going to say that it's impossible. It's just that it's going to be really challenging to do participatory mapping beyond what we've already done in terms of meeting with all of the various stakeholders and vetting the data that exist, and even processing some data that needed to be processed specifically for this analysis. I'm hoping that we can do another check-in with the fishing community before the absolute finalization, of what's going forward, just to try to get it in the best shape possible. At that time, I think if anything seems to be way off, we would want to know about it and can try to figure out why things are way off. But the indications right now is that the areas that look like they're the highest scoring areas are in agreement with the areas that have the lowest fishing pressure, but we still want to validate that. Now, that being said, the next two AOAs will have twice the amount of time to do we don't know yet the regions of which they're going to be assigned, but we'll have twice the amount of time to do the spatial analysis. And we are very much interested in the next two, about having a more participatory mapping process to get more input into fishing. And we don't yet know the regions or the sizes that are going to be, all that's yet to be worked out. But I do think there's a place for participatory mapping. I think there's a place for the continued discussion, and whether or not that occurs now during the screening process, or whether it occurs in the EIS and public comment and public input process, it probably needs to happen at all of them. But there'll be multiple opportunities coming up in the future for additional information. That being said, if you or anybody is aware of any data or any information relating to any of those areas that we showed on the maps right there, we ask you that you reach out immediately so we can talk to you, because we're working on a hard deadline here, and we need as much information as we can.
Thanks, James. Just a follow-up there. So what you're saying is what you're working on now in the Southern California area there, that it's a bracketed set for this time, but should there be another movement in the future, is the database a living, breathing document, so it'll change over time and be added to and refined, and obviously the places you haven't looked yet are in process.
Bob, we have a model. What we're producing here is a model, right? It's an atlas, and then that's going to go into the EIS process and be one of the things, one of the source of intelligence that informs the EIS. I imagine that if we get down the road in the EIS process, something is way off. We're getting public comments that say, hey, you guys didn't incorporate this information, or it wasn't available to you at the time, something news popped up. We will have our models. We would be able to go back and look at, if there's some adjustments that can make it better. And I haven't talked to our EIS team. I haven't talked to Noaa General Counsel about what will happen down the road when public comment comes in. How do we deal with adjustments to the spatial planning to inform that? Because how does all that work? I don't have answers for that. But this process just speaks to the power of data, and we're I speak from experience with this in terms of the fishing community. It speaks to the importance and the power of understanding communities at sea, at fishing communities at sea, and where they fish and how often they fish there. And we're never going to be satisfied with that we have enough data. And I would encourage you that if folks see anything on our maps that look off, that reach out as soon as possible, and we'll try to accommodate. We'll try to bring in that new intelligence whenever we can into the process. But at some point, we've got to publish the atlas, and we've got to move forward into the EIS process and try to catch additional input, at that point.
Thanks, James. Glad you're here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Karin.
Hi, thanks. I'm indulging myself in asking a second question. Thank you. And it's changing gears a little bit in one of my other lives as a natural resource manager. I work with the tri-state group that manages the Dungeness crab fishery, and that fishery, along with some council managed fisheries in the groundfish sector, have some concerns about protected species entanglements and are working actively to address them. So I'm intrigued by your entanglement model, and assume that the primary purpose of it is to look at aquaculture related gear configurations and so on. But any use in the ocean that has lines, that has buoys, that has any kind of infrastructure, and being able to model interactions with protected species is a benefit. And so not only is that relevant for aquaculture, it's relevant for our fisheries, and then even for offshore wind and wave, that's relevant. And so just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that in terms of ability to collaborate and think through some of the gear configurations we might challenge the models with, and the species that you've designed into the model in terms of animal behavior.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Karin, that's a great, insightful question. And I would bear to say that one of the greatest challenges we have with all pioneering ocean industries, including energy, including aquaculture, and whatever's coming at us next, are challenges related to protected species, because we have very little tolerance there to get things right. And we're serious about that. I don't work in our protected resources division. I work in the Ocean Service, but we are doing science with our protected resources colleagues. Desiree Reeve is on the call here with BOEM. We're collaborating with her to build this simulator approach. And what we hope with that simulator approach is that it gives us intelligence. It gives us better understanding about interactions and movements with physical structures, so that we can better design or inform better design of any of these structures that we're putting out there. We've been collecting information, basically intelligence, from other countries about protected species interactions for about 7 or 8 years. We've published a couple of publications. One is Protected Species and Aquaculture Gear Interactions, where we studied the different types of interactions, not just entanglement, but habitat displacement and acoustic impacts and various other types. And we published the state of science on that. And we're using, and we know that data, that information, will help formulate the foundation for consultations and monitoring plans and those kind of things. We are super excited about the entanglement approach. It is high risk, high reward type science. The ability to produce a valuable simulation, is dependent on advanced math and engineering, and the ability to display graphically those simulations, which come from the technology that's part of now these highly advanced simulation software gaming technology systems. We've taken that fantasy-based simulation software and we're converting it into a physics-based simulation approach, and we're pretty excited about the ability to run that. Right now we're working on mussel longline aquaculture systems and floating wind turbine systems, mooring systems, and those two are the most pressing kind of needs in the region. but we hope to advance beyond that into shellfish systems as well. I mean, in algae systems, aquaculture systems, and in finfish cage mooring systems as well. But I want to point out that there's additional approaches underway right now that go beyond simulations, that incorporate sensors and breakaway technologies that reduce entanglement risk based on force load sensors and breakaways. And I know that folks have been looking and have been working with that in that space for the fishing community for a long time. There's a lot of work happening in other countries that's working to employ those technologies. And so, you know, it's a I think everybody wants to hold any new pioneering industries where we have no experience, where we have to rely on basically offshore intelligence about the interactions of these systems. I think we all want to have a very high ethical standard, environmental ethic on this in the very beginning until we get more experience. So we'll see intensive monitoring, we'll see intensive review and intensive EISs that will go through this and establish the baseline. And at least for the first decade or so of these systems being installed, we in our agency will have a pretty heavy hand in working through the permitting process and bringing the resources across our agency to move towards the highest sustainability possible.
All right, we're going to do one last question from Gary Burke, and then we're pushing into our break already. So, Gary, go ahead and.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Gary Burke here. And, you know, this is my just statement. It'll be quick here. But going through and looking at, I'm from Santa Barbara, I'm a commercial fisherman there. And looking at the Santa Barbara area, I'm just surprised how blue and green you came up with. You know, I see there's, in that area, there's halibut trawl. There's some of the trawl is inside a mile, doesn't have to have VMS. There's got shrimp trawl that happens there. We got set nets. We've got drift net guys that fish there. We've got crab fishing that goes on. But my point is that, you know, I try to attend a lot of these meetings, and I've only been to one or two that I've heard of, and I've only had one or two other fishermen. So going forward, man, I don't know how you can get the fishermen's information, but half the people in Santa Barbara, we still have a lot of commercial fishermen here. They don't know this is going on. They don't go to the meetings, and I don't think they know what's happening. I know you guys said you've reached out extensively, but like I said, I've only been to one, maybe possibly two, and I think I only had one other, maybe Mike McCorkle, one of the old guys with me. But to get the young guys involved, I don't know what to do, but when it comes up to what you guys are coming to the final plan, please try to reach out and get as many guys' voices heard as you can. And I don't know the answer myself because I've been trying for years to get guys to step up, and it's hard. So that's just more of a comment. Thanks.
Lance, if I could respond quickly on that, I hear you. We hear you 100%, and you know the interesting thing about this particular about aquaculture planning here is that because you know we in Noaa have an equal value for fishing. You know, we have an equal mandate here to help our commercial fisheries continue to be sustainable and economically viable. So we take it very serious, this dual role of enabling sustainable aquaculture development and ensuring that it doesn't interfere in impact sustainable fisheries, sustainable growth and maintenance of our fisheries. So, you know, if you have ideas, we want to hear them, and we certainly be happy to take your name down and add it to our contacts list, and we'll share with you the associations and the points of contacts that we've been talking to, and make sure that we can, you know, get as much input as possible, especially during the EIS process.
With that, we are working into our break, and so I really want to thank James and Diane. You guys have been incredibly helpful in having us and the council's constituents understand this process, and we look forward to seeing where you go from here. And I believe we will, there's also, this will be on the council's agenda March 5th, and we'll put more info on that down the road. So with that, we'll be at break until 3 o'clock. Well, according to my watch, we've hit the 3 o'clock hour Pacific time, and in scrolling through the presenters list, I see Nessie has joined us, Frank Pendleton has joined us, Ben Ruttenberg is on, Scott Flint, and Andy Lanier. So Nessie, if you'd like to start.
Great. Yes, and we will have 3 slide decks amongst the 4 presenters, and so hopefully that will be seamless. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nessie Sumait, and I'm the BOEM Pacific Region's Chief of the Renewable Energy Section. So I want to first express BOEM's appreciation for the opportunity to present to you today, particularly Chuck Tracy and Carrie Griffin for making this webinar happen. I think it will be useful for us going forward on our planning process. In the Pacific, BOEM is at the very early stages of planning for offshore wind. We have identified more specific areas off the central and north coast of California for lease planning. But in Oregon, we're just starting the data gathering process and conducting outreach and engagement on all areas of the state's coast. So today we hope to provide you with information on our work in progress in both states. We will talk about the considerations for planning, the potential lease areas, some of the data that we have, and provide some preliminary analysis of the data for you to take a look at. I want to thank our state partners for making the time to join us today. Scott and Andy will talk about the data portals that we have created to house and view the data sets that will inform the planning process. So I think as you listen and view the presentation today, we ask if you can think about data that you are aware of that will inform our process, provide input on the characterization of the data that we do have. Like, are there nuances in the particular fisheries that we should consider? And of course, also additional ideas for stakeholder engagement that we should do in the future. So as I said, today we will have 4 presenters from BOEM and our state partners. I'll let them introduce themselves before they present. And we also have several BOEM staff on the webinar. And so together we will try to answer any questions that you all might have. And so I'll keep this brief. And with that, I hand it over to Frank Pendleton as our first presenter.
All right, let me go share my screen here. And just confirming, you can hear me and see my slides there?
Yep, looks good.
All right, excellent. All right, so we'll start off here. It'll be me. I'm Frank Pendleton from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and I'll be with Dr. Ben Ruttenberg from Cal Poly State University, and he'll be talking a bit about some fishery analysis we've been doing. And to give you a basic idea of what I'll be covering here, first I'll kind of give you a basic kind of floating offshore wind 101, because it can be a bit mysterious, and just to kind of get the basics of what we're looking at here. Then we'll talk a bit about the BOEM leasing process, just a touch to get into it, just so folks can kind of understand where the steps in the process. We'll review some key data sets and how they fit into the planning process, areas where it's good for floating offshore wind, areas that have a lot more challenges. And then lastly, this is when Dr. Ruttenberg will come in and we'll talk about fishing data sets. I'll talk of some and he'll talk about the ones that he's busy creating. So to get started with just a bit about BOEM, our mission is to manage the development of the Outer Continental Shelf for energy and mineral resources in an environmentally and economically responsible way. So by these resources, we're talking oil and gas, sand resources, a lot of that more on the East Coast and stuff. There's specific important minerals, those are in there too, but then also renewables. And our jurisdiction is from 3 to 200 nautical miles, the OCS, Outer Continental Shelf, but it excludes national marine sanctuaries, as you can see on the map there. So, and they'll be a concern when we get down to California. So the first question is like, why renewable energy? Just kind of put this in a bit of context. And we can look at the goals for both California and Oregon, starting with California, and it starts with the greenhouse gas reduction goals. And I like to look at the picture. It's simpler for me, but if you're into the hard numbers, they're over here. And basically it's about 1990 levels, and how are we going to reduce from there? So it had obviously gone up a bit, and by 2020, the goal was to reduce to 1990 levels, working down to 60% of 1990 levels by 2030, and down to 20% of 1990 levels by 2050. So when you really think about that, that's a substantial goal. And how are we going to get there? Renewable energy is a key part of that. And kind of the functional mechanism for that is renewable portfolio standards. So how much renewable energy in our grid? And again, I like the pictures over the real numbers. And it gets us up to 2020. California has met their goals, and they're looking to accelerate by 60% by 2030 and 100% by 2045. And yeah, and 100% carbon free by 2045. And Oregon is in a similar place. The numbers are all quite similar, and it's kind of a different graph, but you can see their greenhouse gas reductions, very similar numbers, and similar renewable portfolio standards. I kind of like this view here of their renewable portfolio standard. You can see how low they were back in 2010, and pretty aggressive goals to really step it up. So this is where renewable energy, has to fit into this process. And then you ask, well, why offshore wind? Because renewable, we've got solar, we've got wind. Why offshore wind? Because the ocean is windier, and it's a lot windier than most places on land. You can see the central part of the nation is quite windy. There's a lot of wind turbines there. But when you're looking for the deep dark blue, the highest wind speeds, it's the ocean. It's a lot windier, a lot of power out there. And it's also windy at the right time. And I'm going to quickly cover this duck curve. If you've spent much time looking at renewables in California, you'll see this duck curve. And what these lines represent is, I'm going to read this one right out here, this duck curve one. The power needed from non-solar resources to meet California's electricity needs. So what do we need from non-solar? So as California has really been ramping up the solar, it has other things that come with that. And one thing you want to kind of check out, you see, as we get more and more solar online, in the middle of the day, there's a lot less that needs to come from non-renewable resources. But as the sun sets, we've got to get more and more, right? Each year we need a little bit more electricity, and we get this ramp. So if we walk through 2012, you can see it's not so steep in here. But then once we get out here to 2020, we're really ramping because of the amount of solar. So it's getting to be a real concern, particularly at that time when everyone gets home and turns everything on. So I kind of lit up there between, area around 6 o'clock at night. This is a graph showing wind speed off of probably more central California than Southern California, but in that area near Morro Bay and Santa Barbara, in that area. And what you'll see, we have 4 different months, from the different seasons of the year. And in each case, it's very windy in that late afternoon, early evening. So windy at the right time. It really helps balance the grid. And so why floating offshore wind? And the bottom line is simple. The West is deep. Out east, they're looking at bottom-founded turbines because it's shallow. These 2 maps on either side here, they're the same scale. And the light blue is 30 meters or less. The medium blue is down up to 60 meters. So 60 meters down to 30. That's the area where you might be able to do fixed platforms. You get deeper than that, and it gets to be quite a challenge, and that's the land of floating offshore wind. And you can see out west, we're quickly into that depth zone. And to give you a quick view of some of the possibilities we're talking about here, here are the, on the left side of the shallow water, you see the fixed foundations. monopiles and jackets, these things looking like a electric tower, so it's referred to as a jacket. Those are in our shallower than 60. As you get deeper, we have a variety of floating offshore platforms, you know, from this semi-submersible with the 3 legs here to this one. That's quite an interesting idea. Tension leg platforms, where it's the turbine wants to float up and those are holding it down and the tension holds it in place. And the very simple spar, big heavy thing at the bottom, gonna stay pretty stable. This is just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, just how big these are and how much electricity they can create. And anytime you put a number of what turbine we're talking about, the size turbine, you wait a year and they're talking about bigger ones. The change is, it's amazing. And in this case, we're talking about a 12 megawatt turbine. And some of the developers, these are the turbines they're considering putting in. But the whole idea, just how big they are and how big the blades are, the diameter of the windswept area. You know, at a blade at 351 feet, so over 100 meters, longer than a football field for a single blade. That's a big blade, and that's helping to produce a lot of electricity. I do like in this picture, folks at Humboldt State produce this for us. Like the humpback whale there, kind of really helps to give you some perspective of what we're talking about. And now you don't just put one out there. The general term is a wind farm and a floating wind farm here. And to give you an idea of some of the parts and what we're talking about, you have your turbines that are anchored to the seabed, and then they'll connect up to a substation. So there'll be the cables between the turbines. It'll go to a substation to bump up the power and send it to shore, where it can be transformed to whatever it needs, at an onshore substation and off into the electric grid. So kind of our basic wind farm there. Here's where it gets real. There's a couple of projects that are out there. It's no longer on the land of what do you call them? Prototypes. These are actual hooked up to the grid projects. The first one was Highwind in Scotland. Went out in 2017. 5 of these turbines. These are of the spar variety that we talked of. These are 6 megawatt turbines and producing a total of 30 megawatts. And it's in 130 meter depth. So kind of on the shallower area of floating, but they're getting really good data about how are these working? How can we improve them? Another one with quite a different design is the Windflowed Atlantic project. These are the semi-submersibles. And you can see just 3 years later, and the turbines have gone up to 8.4 megawatts. So just how quickly things are changing. It's also in around 100 meters depth, and it just went out last year. So it's exciting times in the world of floating offshore wind. And I'm just barely touching on it. And if you want to know more, you can't get it from a much better source than Walt Musial there at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And there's the link down here, but it's simple enough if you want to find this video. It's you just Google NREL floating offshore wind. This will be the first thing that comes up. It's about an hour talk that Walt gave last year, and it really covers a lot of things in decent depth, but really well explained. So now to kind of transition from that to the glorious world of leasing, and we'll just cover this real lightly. You can go into this for quite a bit, but it's a multi-year process. And the time frames, there's nothing set in steel here. Somewhere between 7-10 years are reasonable ideas of how long it can take. So we'll start with the planning and analysis phase. And it starts with forming an intergovernmental task force. We'll talk a bit more about this soon, but that's basically bringing together various government agencies, state, local, tribal, and federal agencies together to start the planning process. And they start with data gathering. They find make an area of, okay, here's our planning area. We're gonna gather data and then look at, is it possible for, are we interested in creating a call area where we're saying, okay, we're more interested in this area, and let's really start studying this. And then finally, you identify the actual wind areas that will go through environmental review. So this is where we are both in Oregon. We're in the earlier stages. We're in the data gathering stage. Haven't picked out any call areas for more study or anything yet. Whereas in California and Hawaii, we're quite a bit further along. We've identified the call areas. We'll talk about that a bit more. And we're getting ready to identify the wind energy areas. So from there, those areas will go through environmental review, and then it's off to the leasing process. So there's a couple of steps. Okay, we put out a proposed sale notice and then a final notice, and then the auction happens. And then the highest bidder gets the lease. The lease is issued. And what you get with the lease is basically the right to assess the site. So nothing is set yet when you get the lease, but obviously no one's naive here. You wouldn't be bidding on a place for a wind energy area if you weren't hoping to develop it. But what it really gives you is the right to start assessing the site. So they start assessing things, doing a lot of seafloor mapping and putting out things on the east. You might put out a Met tower. On the west, it's going to be more likely a Met buoy, to get wind speeds and ideas of waves, better than is already available. And they'll take this information, the seafloor mapping, doing their biological surveys for, what's the seafloor like? What critters are living down there? Whales, birds, things like that. And they'll take all this and bring it into a site assessment. And then we'll go through some more environmental review. And if everything is copacetic there, they move on further to the construction and operations plan. Now it's getting, what are we going to build? And what are our plans here? And it keeps getting more and more refined until the actual site is built. And then further down the line, decommissioning is also in those plans. So how are we going to get rid of this at the end? And there's where we are on the East Coast, or in the construction and operations plan phase. And now back to the first stage there. We talked about the intergovernmental renewable energy task forces. And we've got those in Oregon and California now, and also in Hawaii. And the purposes of them is to, we start with sharing information. We bring the different organizations together to share that information, to identify other information we might need for this process, and what opportunities are out there. And it's really a place for a lot of coordination and sharing of ideas and making sure everything that needs to be considered is being considered. But it is not a decision-making body. It's also not chartered under FACA, and I should be able to tell you what freedom of, I can't remember what that one means. Someone will know it. But which means that the membership is restricted to federal, state, local, and tribal governments. It all has to be government members who are actually there. But the meetings are open to the public. And we do have fisheries-related representatives on the task force, folks from NIMS, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife on their respective task forces. So we saw, at the California, we've gone through the people refer to it as the call area. And it comes from some of our bureaucratic language, the call for information and nominations. So we've gone past this planning area phase to places we really want to know more about. So we put out the call. And information, right? That information, anything that's relevant to the site that we should know about, and obviously relevant to folks on this call, any information you may have on fishing that we should know about is highly relevant. Nominations, that's the different developers expressing interest. I'm interested in leasing this place. In the case of the call areas in California, we had in the neighborhood of 14 nominations at each of the sites. From there, we can start identifying the wind energy area for environmental analysis. So it can be the whole call area or a subset of it. And that could be further divided up into lease areas to get us to the leasing process. And then to talk a bit about where we are in some of the activities in the two states. In Oregon, they've got actually the first lease for renewable energy on the West Coast, and actually the first lease for anything on the West Coast in many years. So we're pretty excited about it. So it's the PacWave South project, and it's a marine hydrokinetic research lease for wave energy devices. And that one has been, the lease is out. And then as far as offshore wind, they're in the early stages of planning. So we're in the data gathering and stakeholder engagement part of the plan in Oregon. California, we're further along. We've got our 3 call areas, one in Humboldt, Morro Bay, and then Diablo Canyon. And we're exploring a different, possible additional areas around the Morro Bay area. Just giving you a look at the potential planning area in Oregon. So it's in our federal waters, but shallower than 1,300 meters. It gets very tough deeper than that to anchor anything. And average wind speeds over 7 meters per second. Oregon, it's not a problem. Everything averages over 7 meters per second. So we're in the data gathering phase. We'll be in that through a good part of through 2021. And we're out to ID relevant data and to help inform creating a call area, if that's where we're going to go. Andy Lanier will fill in a lot more on this and talk a bit about Oral Wind Map. And I'm sure Andy will probably tell you a bit about the webinar coming up on the 11th, March 11th as well. And you can always get more info on this at BOEM.gov/Oregon. This I'll cover very lightly. It's the data gathering and engagement plan. And I believe Andy's going to go into this a little bit more. But just a basic idea is we're going to be out there looking for what data is available. Anything folks can tell us, hey, this data is available, you know about it, and we'll be out looking. Talk a bit about how we're going to make it available. Again, this is going to be, Andy's going to go in more depth about Oral Wind Map and how data is being made available for Oregon there. And just wanted to show you a little bit more about the PacWave project and where it is. They're off of Newport. And said it's grid connected MHK marine hydrokinetic project. And they'll have up to 20 commercial scale wave energy converters, 6 nautical miles off of Newport. And it's 6.7 square miles. And that's the actual lease area. In this case, it's the red boxes that we leased. And their project is the black area. All right, so now off to offshore wind and the planning process. And you start from the idea, oh yeah, planning, that's easy enough, right? Let's just put them in the windy spots. And as we can see, Northern California and Southern Oregon, some excellent wind, but all of California, all of Oregon has excellent wind, and a good part of California, but not so fast, right? There are a lot of considerations. So we're going to take a look at the California example and things we have to consider there. And we'll start with the BOEM jurisdiction, right? Our federal waters. And we have jurisdiction from 3 out to 200 nautical miles. And that gives us a total of 215,000 square miles. So as we go, you'll see things change in the map, and we can follow the graph over here about what is left. So if we cut it off at a reasonable depth, it's pretty deep actually, but at 1,300 meters, right? So in the 4,000 foot range. Now we're down to just 16% of that at 34,000 square miles remaining. And then we look at the places that have reasonable wind. Over 7 meters per second is kind of the natural cutoff. That gets us down to 19,000 square miles, or about 9% of where we started. Now, if we remove the national marine sanctuaries, where BOEM does not have jurisdiction, we're down to 6%. So that's kind of our starting point of where we can really even start thinking about planning. But there are a lot more considerations after that as well. Like such as, where's the grid? How close are we to a grid connection? That's a big deal. How are we going to get your electricity to the market? And what you can see here is, down here in the Morro Bay area, there's some pretty big grid connections. This is the smaller red dot, which is still a decent sized connection. It's the old Morro Bay power plant. It's offline. So it is something there with all the wires that go to it that connect to the grid are sitting there. So it's a kind of a stranded asset. The very big red is the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, which is planned to go offline 5 years or so. So that's going to be a huge plug into the grid. And as you can see, the big lines and everything, that's a real asset to take into consideration. Up at Humboldt, there's some assets there to plug right into, but it's not near as ready to go. But it's got the really excellent wind. So just things to consider. We'll zoom in on these a little bit here just to kind of take a view. There's Humboldt with the call area there. Now I'll go on to Morro Bay and Diablo Canyon. And as you can see, there's good reason for assets and other considerations why the call areas ended up there. But there are, again, more considerations that limit us, such as submarine cables, internet cables and other things going across the ocean. There's quite a few of those in California. We can see them coming out of the Morro Bay area as well as south of the Humboldt area. Distance from shore it's a real consideration, and there's no hard, fast, stop or go with distance from shore, but it's a real consideration for a lot of things, such as view shed, right, or fisheries, or marine mammals and birds. These things, it tends to be, the further you get away, you avoid quite a few problems. Just obviously you don't get away from everything, but there's a higher densities closer to shore. But you have challenges as you get further out. We have quite a bit less area available. You can see if we cut it off at 20. And then a lot more cables. Maintenance gets to be a bigger deal, a lot more boat rides for maintenance. The Department of Defense, they have a wind exclusion area for a good part of Southern California, pretty much all of Southern and Central California. So we are presently in talks with them. There's a working group with various members of state and federal government and looking at possibilities. How can we get to something that can work here? So that's a work in process. Slope is another very big challenge. The anchoring things, you can't anchor on a real steep slope. And you can see here, this is the edge of our call area. This is our Morro Bay call area. And on the edge of it here, this is about our 1,300 meter mark. And you can see it drops off quite quickly. So we quickly get deep and we're also steep. So that other reasons for that 1,300 meter mark, why we aren't really looking much beyond that. And to give you a bit of information on some of the other considerations, we were talking much more like physical constraints to it, but there's a lot of other considerations. And there was a renewable energy science exchange that BOEM put on where our various subject matter experts gave talks. And these talks are all available online. They weren't recorded, but the PowerPoints are there. So you can get a lot of information on them. And it has information to contact the folks. This one's easy enough to find too. If you do BOEM, Renewable Energy Science Exchange, that will get you to it. And particularly folks from this crowd, the March 11th one was our fish biologist, Donna Schrader, talking about fish, things relative to fish and fisheries. So it's very interesting. A lot of our various studies that have been done, including things like electromagnetic concerns and things like that. So very interesting. I'll go in a little bit more depth on just one of those here, and I'm just going to show this one slide about birds and some of the data it's in the process of being created right now. And this is a work with BOEM working with Noaa and USGS to take all the data that's out there. We're all about bringing data that's already out there. Let's not recreate the wheel here, right? So bringing all the data together and then working with the experts at USGS and Noaa to model it and get as good of information as we can about where the birds are. Similar things going on for whales, corals, and other things. Just similar modeling efforts. Obviously, it's different data and it happens differently, but similar ideas. And one more challenge here is vessel traffic. There's obviously other challenges that I won't be telling you about today, but vessel traffic is obviously a concern, where the ships are going. And we can see how it changed here. This is AIS data, so it seems folks are familiar with that. It's for basically air traffic control for ships to keep them from hitting each other. And you can use it to find where the ships went. And here we're looking down at our Morro Bay area. Here was 2011. And then some laws changed about what fuels you could burn and where you could drive, where you could take your ship. And in 2017, you can see the boats move quite a bit closer, a lot of ships a lot closer to shore. So this is a concern. We're in, talks with the Coast Guard of how to work through this and whatnot. But yeah, it is one of the challenges to planning this. Talk a bit about outreach. Won't go into depth, but just to give you an idea, in the case of California, we're dealing with our state partners, and we've done quite a bit of outreach, 18 of them to date. I'm not going to read off all of these to you, but just let you know we're always interested in any other outreach opportunities. Obviously, it's a little difficult now in the time of COVID, but we're definitely interested in talking to groups who want to hear from us. In the case of Oregon, right, it's a newer effort, and we're partnering closely with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and presently looking at getting on any standing meetings we can to talk about where we are in the planning process and about who we can engage in this. If you're interested in this, you can, this is an easy enough site to recall, BOEM.gov/Oregon or Oregon Updates, and help you to keep informed of where are things going in Oregon. And obviously, you can, Andy, our next speaker, you can be in contact with him, or Whitney Howard. She's our Oregon contact for BOEM. Oh yeah, and I guess last we could say an outreach summary will be publicly available, and there is the potential for another task force meeting coming up in fall of 2021. Now to get to a little bit of the fishing data that, in both cases, California and Oregon, we've gone out and collected what data we could find that was already available. And this is some of the Noaa data we are happy to use. Summaries of 2002 to 2017 ground fish data from a lot of different data sources that they have analyzed: observer data, state logbooks, fish tickets, electronic monitoring. And just that it gets to this to the geospatial part of it, that we can know where is the fishing happening, which is so important to us. So this has been an excellent data resource for us, and we're interested in any other sources such as this that anyone might know and can tell us about. And now we're going to go on to the VMS analysis, and I'm going to give you a quick little thing here, and then we'll hand it over to Dr. Rettenberger. And the VMS, it sounds like folks understand it quite a bit here, so I won't go into too much, but it's the where. Where were we fishing? Where were we? Basically GPS tracks of certain fishing vessels. And there's various data fields in the background of it: vessel ID, the declaration code. We'll see more about that as we go down there. But then lat long, where were they and when? This is data from we've got the data from the Noaa Office of Law Enforcement, and it involves non-disclosure agreements, right? We can't give it out or share it freely until we've analyzed it and it's summarized. We can be within this rule of 3 so that we aren't showing anything with less than 3 vessels. And we have data from 2010 to 2018. Because of that rule of 3, it's very similar data, but this is AIS data, and it's Hawaii, just so folks know we're taking this privacy very serious. And so we start with the points. Where were the boats at certain times? We take those points and we can create tracks on them because we know the certain times and when. And then we can lay those tracks over areas. It can be whatever size polygons, and say how busy was that polygon. And thus the busy areas, the busy areas we can color brighter, and then less busy areas, less so. And with that, if you're there, Ben, I'll hand it over to you. All right, I'm wondering, are folks still hearing me?
We hear Frank still. I haven't heard Ben yet. Ben, it looks like you're unmuted from our end, so check to see if you're unmuted if you are muted on your end somehow.
I'm doing a test.
Aha.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, if that's Ben,
okay.
We can hear
Great.
you.
The joys of Zoom. So Frank, can you go back one slide and I'll kind of introduce this. So we look at these individual points right now. Again, these are just an example of AIS data, but the VMS data we have are really similar. So we have our collection of points, and what we're really interested to know is to see if, based on the characteristics of those individual points, and in this case we're really focused on speed, can we determine whether we think a vessel is fishing or transiting between two places. Right? Obviously, we want to be able to sort of overlay the tracks like this for fishing activity, not just transit activity. Obviously, transit activity is important, but we're really concerned for now about where these vessels are actually fishing. And so, one of the things that we're especially interested in, we can get some of these VMS data, but those data just tell us where the boats were. It doesn't tell us what they were necessarily fishing or what they were catching. And so what we're trying to do at the moment, we're in the process of this, putting together the VMS data with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife landings data. And now the nice thing is that there are landings receipts which includes what they caught and how much they caught. And in some cases, they actually have fishing blocks, and we'll show you those data in a little bit. But those fishing blocks have really low resolution, and so it's only of limited utility for this application. And so what we're trying to do is combine these two data sets and figure out, are there vessels for which we have VMS tracks, and can we follow a vessel on what we think is an excursion, and then it pulls into a port which we can track on the VMS, and then there's a a landing receipt associated with that. And so when we combine these two data sets, and now Frank, you can go to the next slide, we were trying to get a handle on what these different types of gear were doing and how the vessels were behaving. And so the numbers here correspond to just the number of the sort of the code in the CDFW landings data. And so we've got on the top our fixed gear, right? Our set long lines, our fish traps, and our hook and line. And the histograms show the speeds that we were able to track from vessels for which we were able to match a VMS track back to a fish landings receipt, and that fish landings receipt recorded a gear type that they used. And so we were able to look at the distribution of speeds for those gear types. And then what we're really going to try to do here is figure out, is there a speed at which we think that we can distinguish what's fishing from what's transit to break these trips up. And it looks like in these fixed gear, the speeds seem to be pretty slow, and we're pretty sure that those high points, the high density at those low speeds is probably fishing. And you can see there's sort of a dip that's a little bit less than 5 knots for those, that we think is kind of the point at which they're transiting to, or they're moving between fishing and transiting. And then those two bottom plots show our two different types of trawls. And again, we can see that distribution. What's interesting is that the fishing speeds for those two are very similar and pretty different from our fixed gear. But that cutoff again is kind of around 5 knots. And so, ultimately we're going to be trying to get a little more sophisticated in terms of how we determine what that fishing speed is. But for this example, and also based on some other work that other folks have done, we simply used 5 knots as our initial cutoff. knowing full well that as we dive into this a little bit more, we're going to be able to refine this, and for individual types of gear, potentially use more precise cutoff speeds. So this is how we determine what was fishing and what was not fishing. The other thing that VMS comes with is a declaration code. Basically, it's the operators telling Noaa through that VMS what type of fishing that they're actually doing. And we've grouped them here by colors. Just as an example, our 210 and 211 are more or less limited entry fixed gear. So it's probably, again, those traps, hook and line, and bottom long line is what we're talking about those. Those 220s, primarily midwater trawl, and the vast majority of this is actually whiting, even though there's one of them that's not whiting. That's especially interesting up in Oregon. And then the 230 and 231 are our bottom trawl, primarily for groundfish. And again, there's lots of other things in here that we can use to try to break some of these, either break them out by their declaration codes or group declaration codes in terms of sort of grouping things that are fishing in similar ways together. Now, the one thing is that those VMS declaration codes sort of vary in terms of how accurate they actually are. In some cases, it looks like they're very, very accurate based on the data that we have from the landings receipts. That it looks like the landing receipt matches up really, the gear that they recorded with the landing receipt matches up really well with those declaration IDs. In some cases, it's less accurate. And so going forward, we're going to sort of show you kind of a combination of data here, in some cases using these codes, in some cases not. All right, so first, the plot on the left shows now we're just talking about groundfish, right? So now we're just including those species that are considered in groundfish from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife landings receipts. Those landing receipts also identify an individual fishing block. Now, those small blocks that are closer inshore, I want to say they're about 10 nautical miles on a side. I can't remember exactly how big they are. It's around that size. And some of those, those receipts identify an individual fishing block where they recorded their catch. And so we've plotted these out in terms of tons per kilometer squared. So basically, how much the density of catch that is coming from these individual areas. And and you can sort of see that they're a little bit further offshore, kind of where you'd expect them to be, not too far offshore. Although clearly there are some issues. If you look at that large offshore block that's just below 38 degrees north, that has a very, very high degree or very, very high density of take, we think that might be inaccurate. And again, these are self-reported. So we've now taken those landings data and tried to identify an individual fishing trip that matched that landing receipt, basically the same vessel from the VMS and the same vessel from the landings receipt. And now when we look at the point density, again, using that same very coarse spatial scale, looking at just the point density, essentially just how many of those VMS points are in each one of those cells. And again, we're now using points that had a speed of less than 5 knots, right? So what we are in this case calling our kind of rough estimate of what fishing is. You can see that there's a reasonable match between these two, but certainly plenty of spaces where the VMS point density is very high and the landings receipts are very low, and vice versa. And again, I want to draw your attention to that block just below, that large offshore block just below 38 degrees north. You can see there is what looks like zero fishing activity from the VMS and quite a bit of catch reported from the landings receipts. So, one of the reasons we like being able to use the VMS data is because we know exactly where those vessels were. And we're now in the process of ultimately trying to assign catch back to those individual fishing events that occurred that we were able to track based on the VMS data. All right, and so now we're going to show you a couple of example plots of the VMS tracks, and we're now taking those an individual track, basically a collection of points that, that based on our analysis, we are showing was a fishing event, basically we think is a gear deployment. So on most of these trips, we'll see a series of changes of speed, usually out of port, they're moving relatively quickly, they're transiting out to where they're fishing, then the vessels slow down, and there's a whole series of points that are moving very slowly. We think that they're probably deploying gear, and then the speed will pick up and they'll move somewhere else and deploy gear again. So we have these sort of individual, what we call fishing bouts or fishing events, basically gear deployments. And we've been able to put those together in individual tracks, and this map shows the density of those tracks. And again, we've cut it at 5 fishing bouts. So that's the darkest blue is showing only 5 to 10 of those individual fishing events, and the red obviously shows much higher intensity. And so this map is combining the 210 and 211. That's what we think are the limited entry fixed gear ground fish data combined from all years, from all years for which we have data. That's 2010 to 2018. And this just focuses in on the call areas around Humboldt up north, and then the bottom plot, the 2 call areas out by Morro Bay. The lower of those is the Diablo Canyon call area, and the upper one of those black polygons is the Morro Bay call area. Right, here are those midwater trawl data that we talked about that, again, we think are primarily whiting. Again, same years. You can see the plot on the left, there's not much activity south of Oregon. We zoom in on Oregon, you can see quite a bit of that activity. You can also notice, coming out of, I believe that's Newport, there what looks like a bunch of straight lines coming out of Newport. That certainly looks like an artifact of that we're picking up some transit in there too. And so what this means is that we might need to do a little bit more refining in terms of how we are defining what fishing speed is and isn't. And now here's our ground fish plots. Again, you see that plot on the left is the whole West Coast. The plot on the right, now we're looking at Oregon. And so these are all of those Oregon areas. And you can see there's the fishing activity appears to be pretty well defined along that area. And then the next slide. All right. And so now this is our non-ground fish gears. Some of the other types of fishing. Again, this is combining a whole range of different fishing activity. And so, of course, we can break this out by year. We can break this out by individual declaration. And ultimately, what we're hoping to be able to do is combine the VMS data with landings data from California right now, and hopefully moving up into Oregon to be able to validate, just to see how well the VMS declarations perform relative to things where we have a higher degree of certainty that the vessel is catching what we think it's catching. All right.
I think next is Scott.
Yes, and we'll hold questions until Scott and Andy's presentations are done.
Great, thank you. Let's see, can folks hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
And you can see my slideshow on the screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. So thanks, guys, for that overview of the current work on fisheries data. My name is Scott Flint. I'm with the California Energy Commission, and we've been working with BOEM since the beginning of the Offshore Renewable Energy Task Force, the BOEM California Task Force in 2017. And the Energy Commission role is uniquely situated in our role in this process. Our role is not regulatory at this point for offshore wind. We're California's lead energy policy and planning entity. And so we're working on issues around siting and identifying suitable locations for offshore wind in California on a planning basis, so that we can take those forward in various processes to evaluate the suitability of those areas and to help inform decisions that we make about how we move forward to meet our aggressive energy goals here in California. I've just a little about me. I've been with the Energy Commission for about 10 years working on energy planning activities like this, mostly terrestrial, and the last 4 or 5 years on this offshore wind site. This offshore wind energy work. A lot of the issues that we see pop up in the terrestrial environment and the ocean environment are actually very similar. A lot of people think that there's a lot of room to put something new in the desert, for instance, or in the ocean, but what people don't realize is there's a lot of current use, and every square inch of the desert and every square inch of the ocean is claimed for some use or provides some ecological benefit that we need to maintain and protect. And so it becomes an issue of evaluating how to fit a new use into an area that's already highly utilized in both environments. It's amazing how similar they are in scope. So before I was with the Energy Commission, I'm a 20-year California Department of Fish and Game employee. I have to say Fish and Game because that's when I worked there. It was still Fish and Game. I never got to work at California Fish and Wildlife. So I have a unique perspective, environmental perspective on this. I'm not just an energy wonk. So this has been pretty enjoyable for me as we work through these different planning efforts. Our planning efforts have the dual goal of helping facilitate the siting of renewable energy and also protecting the environment and doing so in an environmentally responsible manner. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit about our role and the work we've done on this data portal, the California Offshore Wind Energy Gateway, and why we have it. So as I said, we have the unique opportunity of being non-regulatory in this process, and so we have worked with BOEM in partnership to help lead the outreach in California and since on offshore wind. And that outreach includes reaching out to local governments and affected communities to talk about the technology and inform them as to what the technology is and how it operates, how it would work, and where it might be deployed off the California coast. We talk about the potential affected environments. We identify and share the technological needs to deploy wind, how it would connect to the grid, the benefits that would come from the power. But we also help identify the potential environmental effects and environmental conflicts and conflicts with other existing uses that might come up in trying to deploy that wind, and discuss the pros and cons of each of those things. So we've been working with BOEM to outreach, like I said, to local governments. We've outreached quite a bit over the years to environmental groups. We've outreached to tribal governments in California, any California tribe of interest that has a stake or is interested in offshore wind issues, and then to a large degree with the fishermen, and all of this outreach continues. We're early in the process of siting, and we're still developing data and information to help us evaluate areas and learn more about the potential effects as we move forward. And we share those with these groups routinely. We'll do that many more times before we get to a project in California waters. So one of the early things we did is wanted to assemble data in a fashion that we have in our other planning processes that have been pretty successful in keeping the affected communities and stakeholders in our processes informed on what we're doing. And so we work with the Conservation Biology Institute in Corvallis, Oregon, through their existing web-based portal to build this California Offshore Wind Gateway and load data sets into it that we would be using through this process to help evaluate, help locate areas and evaluate sites. So Data Basin is their portal. You can reach it at caoffshorewind.databasin.org. It'll take you straight to our California Offshore Wind Energy Gateway. Data Basin is a much bigger data repository that deals with all kinds of issues and has all kinds of data sets in it. Thousands of data sets in it, but this will take you right to the universe that we built for offshore wind energy planning in California. So the site lets you do a couple things. One, you can access and review data and the data sources, and you can download the data and use it in your GIS system if you have one. But if you don't have one, like many of our constituents that follow along in the process, you can use the site to map the geospatial data. It has a mapping component, and folks can use it to examine the data more closely, build their own maps, and turn those layers off and on to be able to access the same data set that we're talking about and that other people are using in their analysis, the agencies and our other constituents. Some other features that are unique to Data Basin and were ready built, and we took advantage of them to help our outreach, is the ability to converse and work in groups with data and maps. So you can, on the Data Basin site, you can form a work group and allow folks who belong or join the Data Basin site to participate in your work group, and you can keep those private and share data just within your work group and maps just within your work group. So if you're participating in one of our processes or workshops, you can share data, build data. You can even load your own data sets in, build your own maps, and bring those to the workshop. You don't have to make them publicly available until you decide to choose to do that. So these are some unique features that we have found important in enabling some of our highly involved stakeholders to be able to work with us and follow along through our processes. And it's been invaluable in having folks understand and us being able to communicate the data we're using and how we're using it in the process, and then how we use that data to make decisions. So for offshore wind, we've assembled approximately, there's plus or minus 650 data sets there, and there's a large variety of data. There's very scientific data sets there, geospatial data sets that are represented, science-based data, and other stakeholder data sets that we can use in various ways. And as James was talking about earlier with the Noaa aquaculture mapping, a lot of those approaches and things he was talking about apply directly here too. So out of the 650 data sets, we have data sets that allow us to characterize areas or look at other things going on in the areas that might not be the main focus of the modeling that we do with the data. And we do modeling in some of the data sets. So we have broken the site into key data sets and into different categories of data. It's organized. We have an organizational structure that I'll show you. I'm going to take us on a live drive of this just for a moment at the end of this to show you a little more than you can see with just the static slides. And then we have pre-built maps so that people can jump in and start working with various sets of data. Sorry. So as I said, this is the structure of some of the key data sets. So out of the 650, we've identified probably 45 to 50 data sets so far that we would consider key to planning. And they fall into the categories of wind energy, existing infrastructure, biological and habitat data, and marine management, and traditional ocean uses. So they're organized that way on the site. And you can click through these various series of folders and examine each of those data sets. And go back. You can reach them from the pre-built maps, or you can evaluate data sets and download them individually if you prefer to use them in your own GIS system. We've had scientific review and discussions with data owners and the data scientists that put the layers together to decide how to categorize them. So you've had a series of publicly attended working sessions with those, a lot of the data generators, researchers, data providers, and to help us sort those into those different categories. So we have a little bit of that kind of work going on. Now, we started this in 2017, and we continue as we open this session to ask folks to identify data and keep letting us know where
Hey, Scott, we lost audio on you.
I think that his call dropped. It looked like he was logged on a computer, but talking through his phone, and I don't. Let's see.
He must be in Clackamas County.
hear me at all? Can you hear me at all, or is it gone completely?
Now I can hear you.
Yeah, you're back.
Sorry. Sorry about that. Somebody said it earlier, the fun of Zoom and Ring Central and everything, Teams and everything else. Great. So I'm coming through clear now. Yeah. So let's see, where was I? Let's see, I just talked about the validation of the data sets and organization, so that's good. So in addition, so on the terrestrial side, we've gone a step farther with our data work, and I didn't show you those areas of data basin because this is the Pacific Fisheries Management Council Habitat Committee, and I don't think you want to see the terrestrial stuff. I'll let people explore that on their own. But we did build basically a decision support tool, and you see a static slide of it here on the terrestrial side that lets us interact with these data sets, overlay them, and do some simple analysis or querying of them to get different solutions on energy in California. And our plan is to extend this to the marine environment using the data sets that we've collected and put in the marine, in the offshore wind energy gateway. And I remember the last thing I was saying about that is, we started gathering data in 2017, and so we continue to update that data, and updating that data. When you go to the fisheries section of the site, you'll see that some updating needs to happen there once BOEM, Noaa, and the folks that are working on the fisheries data sets that you just saw are able to finish that work. So let me just jump quickly to the live site, database and site. And are you seeing that now? My screen changed. I'll assume yes.
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 Sorry. So here's the when you go to California Offshore Wind databasin.org, here's the page you hit. We've set up a few things to make things convenient for folks to jump in. First of all, we have the data in these categories in these blocks. We've categorized it into California Marine and Coastal Energy information, California Marine and Coastal Management information, California Marine and Coastal Ecology, California Marine and Coastal Ecology and Natural Resources, and then California Marine Fishing and traditional uses. So if you want to explore the data, you can go into any of these, and it's structured as I discussed earlier. We have the little folders. You can go to each data set, take a look. Wind resource data, for instance, when you get to one of the data sets, these are all individual data sets. You can click on one and jump in, and there is extensive details about the data set and documentation provided by either CBI or CEC or the data owner or some combination of that. So you can really explore where the data come from and how it should be used. From there, you can jump in and add it to a map, or you can go over and download it if it's downloadable. Some data sets are public but not downloadable, but that's just because the data owner wants you to come to them before you get it. Most are public and available, but the data owner contacts will be here in the information. So that shouldn't slow you down at all. Also on the main page, we had set up a few maps. You saw Frank's look like this. So when you open a map, it will spin up the data sets. And we started with this sort of map. That's the coast and the wind, basically some of the main features for offshore wind. You have the wind speed data, the call areas, and the some of the interconnection points to the transmission system on the terrestrial side already identified for you here. You can explore the data layers. You can hit the data right from here, and you can do some simple filtering and change the style and do a little bit of analysis here. You can read the details of the data and go to that data view and then download it from here also. And you can very easily just build your own map by adding other data sets. So recent items that I viewed are here in my little space, and I can just pick one and add it to the map, just like that. And then it'll spin it up, and I'll be building my own map. So for folks that don't have GIS, you can see how useful this sort of thing can be to help track and follow along with what we put out. Yeah, it works relatively fast. It depends on the speed of your internet. So I just want to jump to what we call the California Energy Infrastructure Planning Analyst. This particular application is not in Data Basin, but it's built from Data Basin and ties to the data layers on there. And what we've done with this is take a variety of energy, environmental, and land use data sets that we can then query against specific questions or for specific information that will identify us areas on the map. And it depending on what you want and what you pick, you can identify areas that are great for renewable energy or areas that are great for environmental conservation. So you can pick those areas here, and I've already jumped to, I'm kind of shortcutting things so I can show you. But you can also view each of the sort of data layers that are in here for the different areas just by simply turning them off and on. And then the other tool you have here, you can do an analysis of these areas. So I've identified of areas you either draw or areas that you can load into and drop into this tool. So I've identified these 3 areas. It's spinning up during a little work. I've identified these 3 areas that potentially work for terrestrial wind because they have high wind speed, and I can then hit the analyze button and have it run my shapes against all of the data sets, environmental, land use, and energy, and pull out the resulting information here. And if I want to compare the areas based on wind power density right here on the screen, I can see shape A, shape B, and shape C has different amounts of wind power density. I can see what they are and how many acres of that is in each shape. You can do that with each set of this information, including environmental information. If you're concerned about wetlands or protecting terrestrial and intact habitats, or a conservation value that you generate through some sort of model, connectivity, those sorts of things are programmed in here. And this tool lets you work with those things. If I'll click on terrestrial intactness just to show you, this is a layer that we built with CBI. It looks like this on the map, where highly intact terrestrial habitats are in dark green, yellow to blue are less and less intact. And so the areas quickly will be broken out for you to tell you how much of an area would be intact in a percentage basis based on the area you've gone. And if you zoom in close, or you'll be able to actually see where that is in your area, so that you may have areas that still work for what you're trying to do, but you can examine those things more closely with this kind of tool as you make decisions. We can also use this sort of tool to demonstrate how we make decisions with the data as we go through outreach. So this is the terrestrial environment, and we are going to we are working right now on a couple things to port this to the marine environment. So, stakeholders ask us to build this data set for offshore wind, similar to what we've done for the terrestrial work. So we collected the data, and then of course the stakeholders said, please do something with that data and model it as you did on the terrestrial side. So right now we currently have 2 projects going that are updating the data sets on database and are helping us port this tool over to the marine environment. And I'll just briefly describe 2 of those. One is Conservation Biology Institute. They're working on building us a model that looks at some key themes: overall suitability for offshore wind, environmental considerations, existing ocean uses, energy potential, and then offshore wind deployment feasibility. So we're thinking those are the analysis themes that will be built into their model, and the model will let you examine those themes when it's ready. So what I'm showing you, this terrestrial landscape model, is a model that was built by CBI for the terrestrial environment, and it's built in their environmental evaluation modeling system. And so the work they're doing now will build a model in the marine environment using the key data sets that we're identifying further, and we're further refining and updating through this project to then build this sort of tool for the marine environment. EAMS is modeling software that lets you make decisions about how to assemble a whole stack of data layers, and there's another site here, EAMS, EMMSonline.org, shows you how EAMS works and how CBI uses it to develop these models. This is the same terrestrial intactness model that we built for the terrestrial environment for energy planning, and there are a lot of others here that CEC, the Energy Commission, and other folks have developed, and you can go in and explore each of those models, and you can actually interact with them on the site, tweak them, and see how the whole EAMS software system works. I'll invite you to do that if you're interested. So right now, CBI is we're starting to build this EAMS model for the marine environment. When they're done, this particular analytical tool will be updated to support that and the data that is been collected for offshore. A second project that we're doing that is related and integrated closely with CBI's project is a project that is being done by Point Blue Conservation, and they will be working with they're working jointly with CBI to update data sets, make sure those data are available on database, but they're also going to do an optimization analysis and a gap uncertainty analysis of the data as they take it and assess the data in in a similar way, looking for areas that are most suitable for offshore wind and least suitable for offshore wind because of the potential environmental conflicts or the ecological importance of the areas. And so they're, instead of just this map tool and data sets results, they're going to publish a set of large scale maps and a report that does both a large scale and fine scale analysis of areas, of suitable wind areas off the coast, and compares them to each other and shows us where the optimal areas are. And they're working to develop their own modeling approach using our software, and they want to. One of their big focuses is being able to capture uncertainty of the data, the various data sets, in that analysis and how it affects the outputs and the optimization to identify those areas. So that work is ongoing. The CBI work will be done in probably June of this year, and the Point Blue work has another year to go, and we're trying to get the timing of those two a little more closer together so that we're able to use products from both in the viewer and make sure they're available on database. So that's all I wanted to share on where we're at on our work. And again, we're eagerly looking. I invite folks to go examine the data sets we have here, use the viewer, use the mapper, investigate the modeling software, and so that you'll be ready to take a look at the work that comes out when we port this over to also include the offshore areas of the state. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And hopefully, I think we're still doing good on time. Andy, you're up next.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Andy Lear. I'm the Marine Affairs Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is the agency that helps to coordinate ocean policy in the state of Oregon. And I am the intergovernmental task force support staff for the state, whereas my colleague Whitney Hauer is the support for the task force from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Today I want to talk about the work that we've been doing to develop the data catalog and the generation of our own offshore wind planning and mapping tool, which we have called Aura Wind Map. As Frank mentioned, and just to provide a little bit more background on where we are, our task force kind of spun up again in 2019 after being dissolved kind of from the original implementation of the task force, which was established to create discussions and coordinations around the original Windflowed project, which was down off of Coos Bay in Southern Oregon. In that first September 2019 meeting, we got together, talked about the fact that both BOEM and the state were interested potentially in taking a planning approach to the siting of offshore wind off of the Oregon Outer Continental Shelf. As a result of that, we worked to pull together a data gathering and engagement plan, which Frank has already mentioned. And in June of 2020, over a remote meeting, the state committed together with BOEM to conduct that planning process. And in October of that year, we finalized kind of what that initial data gathering and engagement plan is, and then talking about how that can help us to move forward. So you saw Frank's slides that covered the leasing process. One of the things I wanted to point out is that we're kind of even before that. So on the left side of this diagram is the kind of, we are here, we're taking about a year to implement the data gathering and outreach plan, which will then lead into those steps that are part of the official leasing process, which are kind of kicked off with an initial call for information and nominations. I'm not going to go into all of the details on kind of the leasing aspect of the slide, since I think Frank did a good job of describing those. But suffice to say, we're still talking about being on the very early end of our process in Oregon. So we are focused our data gathering on kind of this area as shown. This is bounded on the east by state waters and bounded on the west by a depth mark of 1,300 meters. Really all of that area has an average or above average of 7 meters per second. So really that whole area is potentially viable from an energy development perspective, or at least that's what the developers tell me. And then to get into a little bit more of the details on what we have been doing, we have had several outreach meetings to date. Those have been coordinated through requests for BOEM and the state to provide kind of information. Those have occurred with a local group called Ocean out of the area of Coos Bay and the Oregon Coastal Zone Management Association, which is more of a statewide local government group of representatives. We have continued that outreach with one-on-one meetings with local county officials, where we are trying to identify opportunities to engage in meetings that are already on the books to leverage the ability to connect with as many people as we can in our virtual world of today. So we do have a number of meetings on the books with local commissions coming up in March. And we also have kind of the official public launch of the Aura Wind Map tool with a public webinar. And then coming towards the end of winter into spring and summer, we hope to hold more focused small group meetings, conduct some additional listening sessions, some additional public meetings. And we have an asterisk there because we did hear from our stakeholders and from our task force about the importance of in-person meetings if that is safe. So we all have our eye on the potential to meet face-to-face, to be able to talk about these things, and to be able to inform the planning process moving forward. We don't have a date yet set, but the next task force meeting will be a meeting where we report out on the data gathering and engagement kind of activities, where we'll present a report on that. So talking about kind of data that we are pulling into our catalog, it's important to recognize that the state of Oregon as a whole has been through other marine spatial planning processes before and has an existing kind of data infrastructure. From our coastal program specifically, we have an extensive archive of data that is hosted on the Oregon Coastal Atlas, which is the repository of all of the data sets that were developed in those planning exercises. And when I speak about that, I'm talking about the designation of marine protected areas and marine reserves in the late 2000s to the creation of a marine renewable energy development plan in state waters in between 2012 and 2019. So those information resources are available to pull upon, and they do include efforts to understand our natural resources, the beneficial uses of the ocean environment. We did not specifically cut off data just because it was outside of our territorial sea. So when we were gathering data, it applied to our continental shelf, although it was, I think, focused on state waters, which is the 0 to 3 nautical miles. We do have additionally other existing kind of spatial data sources within the state that can provide information on the terrestrial realm. So when you think about elevation data, hazards data, planning data, those, many of which are hosted through the Oregon Spatial Data Library. And like Scott just mentioned, the state of Oregon is actually right now leveraging the database and tools and technology as a part of the Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment, or ARESA project. And so if you go to database, and there is actually an Oregon Renewable Energy focused collection of data, which does include offshore. And so that collection of information exists, although that project is focused on renewable energy more broadly rather than only specifically in the offshore region. So Oregon does have and can leverage spatial data infrastructure to inform our offshore planning process, but we do depend upon a number of our federal partners to provide data from their authoritative sources. These include sources like the Marine Cadastre, the Ocean Reports tool, which are part of Noaa's digital coast effort to make sure that we provide as much data and information as we can. The Noaa Fisheries, Fisheries Research and Monitoring Group, or FRAM for short, provides an extensive collection of the fisheries data and information, of which you saw Frank posted a little screenshot of that that's already in our catalog. So to date, we have been gathering data and information from both Oregon and the federal data catalogs, and we are curating them in an offshore wind-focused catalog that is being hosted by the West Coast Ocean Data Portal, which is a group that's been around for a number of years and has networked data and information resources across the West Coast as a part of work to support the West Coast Ocean Alliance. I happen to be a co-chair of the data portal, so that's one of the reasons why we were able to leverage the technology and the efforts of that group to date to really spin up our effort in a short amount of time while we're leveraging the investments that have already been made. So you can discover the Aura Wind Map tool through a number of places, the first of which is our Regional Ocean Data Portal site, the second of which is the BOEM website, and the third of which is Oregon's Ocean Planning Information site, OregonOcean.info. All of those locations can direct you to the main homepage of our catalog, as well as take you to the offshore wind mapping tool, or a wind map. The catalog that we have built connects the data sources across the West Coast through their metadata catalogs and through the published server infrastructure that exists. So many of the sources that are publishing data use ArcGIS servers, and they host the information in the layers. And what we have done is we have harvested selected records from across that landscape and provided the ability to query those in a seamless way. So on the left side of the data portal catalog, which we are still in the process of building out, you can see a number of ways to facet your search, or the search for your information. I hope to take a quick spin of this in live form after I run you through a few slides. We have also provided some curated entry points into the data sets that we have loaded into Aura Wind Map. So if you're interested in one specific kind of topic, you can get there by clicking on a tile in the portal, and it will open up the Aura Wind Map tool with that selection of information available. Here's a quick screen grab from the entry point into the portal that provides a little bit of information and lets users know where to find out more. On the left side of the diagram here, you can see that our information is organized in a catalog that's thematically grouped, so biological, human, and physical. It has a standard set of base maps and the ability to bookmark tools. So when you turn on or off data layers of interest, you get those services that show up on the map. Here I've changed a base map to an imagery source. I've selected some information on wind speed, direction. I've provided bathymetric contours, the 1,300 meter depth mark, and current magnitude and direction. Because of the way that the wind and the currents interact, it forms a nice picture so that you can begin to understand the context of the environment that we're talking about. Additionally, we provide information on some of the other important natural resources that are present on the outer continental shelf. So marine mammals, which includes our whales and our pinniped species. And then we also have marine industry related data, so fisheries, as well as some of the marine industry transportation related data sets that can demonstrate relative levels of use by Oregon's different ports. And you can see here the ability to use a nautical base map, which is a familiar kind of base map for those who spend their time on the water. And then finally, we have a collection of our important territorial sea plan related data, and here you have just a quick screenshot of our viewshed data set, which was created as a part of the development of the Marine Renewable Energy chapter in the territorial sea plan. I'm actually going to step out here and start a new share if we have the time to just take a quick spin in the on the portal itself. So are you now seeing the portal?
Yep.
Great. So right on the home page here, if you're interested in just going into the map viewer for offshore wind planning, you can click that button. But what I'm going to do is go into the data catalog itself to show you some of the power of the facets that are possible. One of the first and most powerful is the ability to select an intersection of a map with the data sets that are available. You can see that the number that we have here at the top of our catalog changed when I made that selection. It's really easy to clear the selection and reset your search. But when you are using the catalog, it's important to pay attention up there because sometimes you may want to eliminate a filter and go back to a larger set. So we do have a map, we have a keyword, so you can see some of them that I've already added, but if I wanted to look for kelp resources as an example, I could very quickly find that information. We have sorted our information through a hierarchical categorization. So here you can see, just like our Aura Wind Map tool, some of the structure of the data and information which is present in the system. Right now we have tagged 168 different layers that have some association with fishing, and some of those are management related data sets. Others are actual fisheries mapping data sets themselves. Here you can see a collection of the data that was created by the state of Oregon for supporting the territorial sea plan as an example. So you can really quickly narrow down a search that you're looking for. And we are still working to build out and develop additional pages that can provide some of the context and allow users to browse the specific resources in another way. One of the other important methods for searching data specifically is if you know the source that it's coming from. And so here you have a number of the data sets that we have been able to connect to over time. They include both state resources, regional resources like our ocean observing systems, as well as our federal data resources from different programs. And because we are talking about fisheries today with the Fisheries Management Council, what I have done is load up the fisheries data layers that we currently have in the system. And you can see then the ability to turn on and off the layers of information that we have that are derived from either the territorial sea planning effort, which I've mentioned already, or the Noaa fisheries mapping data. And the ability to look at both of these resources together, can give a perspective of kind of the different levels of knowledge associated with different fisheries of importance, as an example. So I've turned on, in this instance, cat shares for bottom trawl, together with the Astoria-based product, which was a group created value of the fisheries from the perspective of all of Astoria's fishing sectors. And this effort was created with the EcoTrust fisheries mapping project that was part of our territorial sea plan effort back all the way in 2012. So it's a little dated, but I think still very valuable. And with that, I'm going to go back into my presentation, and we will finish things off here. So like Scott mentioned, the state of Oregon and BOEM intend to provide an opportunity to review the data and information that are a part of our catalog. This will include both the state archives as well as the federal data archives. It's likely that the meetings will be virtual later this spring, and if you're interested in participating, please contact either myself or Frank Pendleton. With that, I turn things back over to you, Lance.
Thanks, Andy. We have a few minutes for questions, so if you have a question for any of our offshore wind planning presenters, please use the raise hand function and we'll get you on. Karen, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you to all four of you for joining us today and providing the information. I know it was appreciated by all. And my question is a little bit philosophical, and just put it out there, not necessarily for answering today, but something that strikes me in listening first to the Noaa presentations on aquaculture opportunity areas and now on offshore wind. It's clear that there are very similar data collection and mapping and portal access projects occurring, and that instead of them running parallel, that they could be coordinated and could be less redundant. So this is not, again, I'm not expecting an answer to that today, but I think it's a really important question, how we can combine the processes, align the processes so that there isn't such duplication of effort. And if there are quick comments on that, love to hear from you guys today, but I think it's an ongoing conversation.
This is Diane. I'm still on, and I can respond from the Noaa Fisheries perspective and IMCOS perspective. And I'm guessing that Boehm will also want to respond. We are having meetings to compare data, and so that sharing and discussing data and process is part of our two processes. But our spatial planning goals are also a bit different, and so for us with the AOA process, that's a planning process. It's not a regulatory process per se, not a permitting process, and so that separates it a little bit from the Boehm process, which is based on a leasing framework. So hopefully I'm capturing that correctly for my Boehm colleagues, but please rest assured that the discussions and opportunities to share data and collaborate are ongoing.
Yeah, this is Nessie from Boehm, and that is true. We are collaborating on at least the data, but the use of the data is slightly different for both processes.
Yeah, and I'm thinking from thank you for those responses. I'm thinking from the fishing industry and harvester perspective that there are these two processes going. They seem to be very similar. They're both asking for input on the same thing, and they're both using different maps. And so thinking about that from your stakeholders' perspectives and maybe how that, I trust and I know those conversations are happening in the background, but from the stakeholder side, it may not be as transparent how they are the same or different. And asking for input for two separate, parallel, but coordinated processes is challenging. So I appreciate it, and thank you again for all the work and your presentations today.
This is Andy. I'd also like to respond, Karin. I think it's very important for us to all be knowledgeable and aware of the myriad sources of data that are available on the West Coast, and would want to see, as we have tried to promote with the West Coast Ocean Data Portal, a system where all of those sources that are providing data are capacity is added to them as is necessary, and we can all benefit. Because given technology today and what I showed you, very few of those data sets were actually coming from a source that we hosted. And therefore, we're creating an ecosystem across the West Coast of data providers, and the better those resources are, the more we can all benefit from them together. And that is one of the concerns I've had about development of systems that don't provide additional service capacity or have the same ethic for sharing the information that's been gathered in a single place. And I would want to promote that across the region, given that the fisheries that exist on the West Coast are regional in nature. Products that are developed for California, for example, but that are regional in nature should be shared so that Oregon and Washington can benefit from them.
Okay, we'll go to Mike Conroy for the next question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lance. And I just want to, at the outset, thank everybody for participating, and thank the Habitat Committee for holding this webinar. If for no other reason, it's a chance for folks to see, many of them for the first time, just how far-ranging and how far-reaching offshore development activities are. Both their new uses, competing for space, which we have come to rely upon, both for our own livelihoods and our ability to feed the nation. Each of these proposed uses come with some serious foundational concerns regarding ecological, environmental, and socioeconomic realities of the viability. And I think each and every council fishery will, to some degree, be impacted by offshore wind and the necessary infrastructure. I think I want to piggyback a little bit on what Karin just said. to me, it was quite interesting comparing the NIMS approach with the aquaculture opportunity areas with the BOEM approach with regard to offshore wind. As for the BOEM folks, as you saw during the NIMS presentation on aquaculture, they really have prioritized engagement in public planning processes prior to the regulatory process. It seems here we're close to identifying WEAs off California, and there really hasn't been much meaningful engagement to date. I saw this in a public comment just the other day, confusion by diffusion seems to rule the day here. It's, we've just seen here today just how much stuff there is out there to track and follow. As future call areas are identified off Southern Oregon or Mendocino, I think I speak for a number of attendees in saying that we hope you learn from that model. In terms of the NIMS approach, focusing on specific areas and projects to ensure they are high quality and thus least impactful, and taking lessons learned from early projects and how they can be applied to later projects might be a more appropriate path. I think to channel my inner Chris Bound, please don't forget about us. And then I guess from my perspective, hope springs eternal. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Consistent with what I'd mentioned earlier in the meeting, I'm gonna preferentially move Arlene Merrim's question up, and then that's gonna be the last question, given that we're running 15 minutes over for the presentations and Q&A. And I do want to remind people that this meeting was recorded. There will be a link to the recording on the council website in the next day or so. Also, most of the advisory bodies have a marine planning agenda item coming up at the next council meeting. And as a reminder, the full council will take up this agenda item on March 5th. So if you didn't get an opportunity to provide feedback or ask questions during this session, please take advantage of those opportunities. And with that, Arlene, you get the last question.
Okay, thanks, Lance, and thanks for the presentations. They were very instructive. And I was just curious, kind of piggybacking on what Karin and Andy were talking about, more specific to the data, the development of the layers going into your spatial analyses. So, where Noaa was presenting some modeling efforts and wondering if those same kinds of development steps were going into the same data sources that are being used for the BOEM process, if that makes sense. I guess that's directed at either or.
I'm not sure if we, and this is Bessie, I will try. So as we move along in the process, we sort of use the information in like a different, like a more refined way. So in the call area, we're just looking at the, the bigger area, and then we do an environmental analysis. And then, they do, like we said, the site assessment. And then we don't really know when, then when we have the construction operations plan, when we do a final EIS, the actual placements of the turbine, in which you can even do a more refined analysis at that point. So I guess what I'm saying is it's the data continues to be used in different ways as we advance through the leasing process. And I'm not sure if that really addresses your concern. And if not, you could let us know.
Thanks, Nessie. With that, I'm going to briefly turn everything back over to Carrie.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, everyone, especially all the BOEM and the Noaa presenters. That was a brain full of information you presented, and that took a lot of work on your part. And thanks for everyone for sticking around. As Lance already said, I think he covered pretty much what we needed to. We'll get the recording processed and look on our homepage for a link to that within the next day or two. Here's a couple of relevant links here on my screen. You should be able to see it right now. Our homepage, and then here's a direct link to our March council meeting, and which you can access through our homepage. And then for public comments, Lance also mentioned this right up front that we took as much public comment as we could accommodate today, but the real formal opportunity for making public comment is on the agenda item at our March council meeting, which is circled here in red. This is Friday, March the 5th. It's the last agenda item of that day. The same presenters or some group of them will provide a summary of what they presented today on that day to the full council. It'll be briefer one, obviously, because we only have 2 hours for that whole agenda item. And if you want to submit public comment on this, here's a link to our public comment portal. And that goes to all of our public comment for all of our meetings. Let me see if there's anything else I need to cover. No, I think we're good. So I think Lance wants to go into a Habitat Committee discussion. It's also a public meeting, so people can sit there and listen, but this is mostly for the Habitat Committee to discuss. So I will stay on also, just since I'm a host of the meeting. And if anyone has questions, you can reach me by email. If you don't have it, it's you can go to our website and scroll to contacts and find me there. Thanks again, and that's all I have to say. So Lance, it's all yours.
Thanks, Carrie, and again, tremendous amount of thanks for our presenters. They're covering a large amount of information in a short period of time, and it's been really beneficial to understand the state of planning on the West Coast. So with that, I'm going to call a recess for the Habitat Committee. Let's start back up at 5 p.m. Pacific, and we'll work on our report for the supplemental, or for the briefing book. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.